Imagine a group of people who have lived their entire lives inside a dark cave. They are chained in place, facing the cave wall. They can't turn their heads or move their bodies. Behind them is a fire. Between the fire and the people is a low wall, like the kind used in puppet shows. Other people walk behind that wall, carrying objects. The fire casts shadows of those objects on the wall in front of the chained people. The shadows are all they've ever seen. To them, the shadows are real. I'd love to invite you to share in the comments where you're listening from and what time it is. It's incredible to think about how we're all connected through these stories and ideas. If you enjoy these thought-provoking explorations, consider subscribing to Tired Thinker so we can keep bringing you reflective narratives. Now, settle in, get comfortable, and let your imagination drift as we delve into the mind-boggling paradoxes and mysteries. They see the outline of a horse, and they believe they've seen a horse. They see a cup and think it's an actual cup. They know nothing of the objects behind them or the people carrying them. They don't know about the fire. They believe the shadows make up the whole world. Now picture one of the prisoners is freed. At first, he doesn't know what's happening. He resists. The chains come off, but he feels pain. His muscles are sore. He's never turned his head before. He looks at the fire and it hurts his eyes. He's never seen real light. It blinds him. He wants to go back to the shadows, back to what he knows. But someone urges him forward. He climbs out of the cave. He sees sunlight for the first time. It overwhelms him. The light is too bright. He shields his eyes. At first, he sees only shapes and colors. Nothing makes sense. Slowly, his eyes adjust. He sees trees. He sees the sky. He sees a stream, rocks, animals. Then he sees the sun. He realizes the sun lights the world. It makes everything grow. It warms his skin. He understands the sun gives life. This man now knows the truth. The shadows were just images. They were copies of real things. The people in the cave had only seen poor versions of the real world. They didn't know they were in a cave. They didn't even know they were prisoners. The man thinks of going back. He remembers his friends who are still chained. He wants to free them. He returns to the cave. It's hard to go back. The darkness surrounds him again. His eyes take time to adjust. He can't see well in the dim light. The others hear him. He tells them what he saw. He says the shadows aren't real. He tells them there's a whole world outside the cave. They don't believe him. They laugh. They say he lost his sight. They think the journey harmed him. They call him a fool. Some get angry. They don't want to hear it. They would rather stay with what they know. This story shows how people can live in ignorance and think it's the truth. They grow used to shadows and call them reality. They reject anything that doesn't fit their experience. They don't ask what lies beyond. They don't question the limits of their world. They don't know there are limits. The cave is not just a place. It's a condition of the mind. People live in caves when they only accept what's familiar. They stay in caves when they fear change or question nothing. The chains are habits, assumptions, routines. The shadows are opinions, trends, headlines, images on a screen. They move across the wall. People watch them all day and think they're seeing life. The fire represents a false source of truth. It lets the shadows exist, but it doesn't show the real world. It creates just enough light to confuse people. It gives them a version of things, not the things themselves. Climbing out of the cave is hard. It takes effort and pain. You have to break habits. You have to think. You have to doubt what you've always known. It's uncomfortable. It doesn't happen fast. People don't want to do it. It's easier to stay where you are and trust the shadows. Sometimes a person sees the real world by accident. A teacher opens a door. A book makes them stop and think. A quiet moment gives them a question they can't shake. They start to notice cracks in the wall. They wonder where the light comes from. They begin to look around. When someone leaves the cave, they don't become smarter overnight. They become aware. They notice they were blind. They see how limited their view was. They understand they knew almost nothing. That's the first step to real knowledge, knowing you were wrong, knowing you missed something big. Now imagine the people who left the cave decide to stay in the light. They don't want to go back. They feel safe outside. But the cave still holds most of the population. If no one returns, the others stay trapped. To help, someone has to go back down. They have to try to free others. That's where it gets risky. When you go back into the cave, the people don't want your help. They think you're a threat. They attack your words. They mock your ideas. They tell you to leave them alone. If you push too hard, they might fight back. They don't want their world challenged. They hold on to their chains. This happens in real life. People get used to their beliefs. They protect them. They avoid discomfort. When someone presents a new idea, it feels like an attack. Even if the idea brings light, they turn away from it. Think of a classroom. Students learn facts from a board. They memorize them and repeat them. Few ask where the facts come from. Few ask if they're the whole picture. They trust the voice at the front. The classroom becomes a cave. The chalkboard becomes the wall. The teacher's words become the shadows. Now think of a workplace. People follow routines. They check boxes. They hear goals and chase them. They don't always know why. They don't always ask what the work is for. They stay in the cave. The shadows become metrics. The fire becomes a screen with a chart. The cave is not always dark and damp. It can be bright and air-conditioned. It can have coffee and high-speed internet. It doesn't look like a prison, but it works the same way. It keeps people looking in one direction. It keeps them from asking deep questions. The allegory of the cave is not about ancient people. It's about anyone who has lived by assumptions. It's about anyone who's stopped wondering. It's about you if you've ever accepted something just because it's common. It's about me when I avoid hard truths. Leaving the cave doesn't mean rejecting everything. It means testing things. It means turning around. It means looking for the fire, then looking past it, then asking what makes light itself. It means not settling for shadows. If you've ever had a moment where the world felt bigger than you thought, you've glimpsed outside the cave. If you've ever seen someone cling to a false idea because it was easier, you've watched someone choose the shadows. If you've ever gone back to help and been rejected, you know the risk. But it's worth it. Not because it's easy, not because you get applause, but because the truth is better than a shadow. Because light shows you what's real. Because the world outside the cave is where things grow. Someone says they have a beetle in a box. You're not allowed to look inside. You ask what it looks like. They say it's green. You ask what it eats. They say leaves. You ask whether it crawls or flies. They admit they've never opened the box. That raises a question. How do they know it's a beetle? If they've never seen it, touched it, or watched it move, what makes them so sure? Maybe someone told them. Maybe the box shakes in a way they think matches a beetle moving around. But they don't have direct evidence. They're relying on an idea rather than an observation. This thought experiment comes from Ludwig Wittgenstein. He used it to show how language can work without us needing to check every detail. The beetle is just an example. What matters is how the word is used. The people talking about beetles are part of a language game. The word beetle might be doing more work than the actual object inside the box. Now think about a group of people. Each one has a box. Each one calls what's inside a beetle. No one is allowed to look into another person's box. Over time, they all use the word beetle in conversation. They might say, "My beetle is restless today," or "My beetle hasn't moved." The word gets used just like that, in shared ways. But no one ever checks anyone else's beetle. In fact, some boxes might be empty. Some might have a rock inside, but the way the word is used remains the same. That's what Wittgenstein was getting at. When we talk about things like pain, memory, or thoughts, we act as if they're concrete objects. We say, "I feel pain," or "I remember that," and others respond with concern or agreement. But they can't see the pain or the memory. They rely on behavior, tone of voice, context. The words work even though the thing itself stays private. Take a child who scrapes her knee. She cries. An adult says, "You're hurt." The child learns to say, "I'm in pain," not by looking inside herself, but by connecting words to situations. Over time, she uses pain in the right settings. She says it when she falls. She says it when she gets a shot. She learns the word the way we learn all language, through use. This doesn't mean the pain isn't real. It just means the word pain gets its meaning not from a private feeling, but from public use. If no one else had ever used the word, if no one else ever responded to it, it wouldn't work. Language depends on shared rules, not on each person having access to what's in someone else's box. Think about how we say we understand someone's feelings. "I know how you feel," we say. But we don't. We can't get inside their head. We use the phrase because it fits the moment. It shows support. It keeps the conversation going. It follows a pattern we've seen before. The phrase has meaning in how it's used, not in its accuracy. Or consider someone who says, "I'm anxious." They might look calm. They might be pacing. They might sit quietly and avoid eye contact. We believe them not because we see the anxiety, but because we've learned to trust that statement in certain contexts. We accept it the way we accept that there's a beetle in the box. We don't need to open the box to play the game. This approach to language strips away some of the mystery. It shows that words don't always refer to things in the world. Sometimes they just mark a place in our interactions. They carry meaning because we agree, even without proof, on how to use them. In technical terms, Wittgenstein was arguing against the idea of a private language. That's a language where words refer to things only one person can know, like their own sensations or thoughts. His point was that if a language were truly private, it wouldn't work. There would be no way to check if you were using the words right. You couldn't correct mistakes. You couldn't teach it. You couldn't tell the difference between remembering the right use and just thinking you did. Back to the beetle. If no one ever looks in anyone else's box, then the word beetle no longer needs to point to an object. It becomes a placeholder, a shared label for something that might or might not exist. What keeps the word going is not what's inside the box. It's how people talk about it. This might sound strange at first, but it applies to more than philosophy. Think about how we talk about taste. One person says, "This soup is salty." Another says, "It's not salty at all." Neither one is wrong. They're both describing a reaction. But we can't open a box and check what salty is for each of them. We accept both descriptions because we've agreed on how the word works. The same goes for love, anger, boredom, or hope. These words shape how we talk about inner life, but they don't refer to fixed objects. They're tied to behavior, tone, timing, and context. We learn their meanings by watching others use them, not by inspecting the feelings inside our own heads. Wittgenstein wasn't trying to say people don't feel pain or that emotions aren't real. He was saying that the way we talk about them doesn't depend on private inspection. It depends on shared use. That's how language works, not by pointing inward, but by following public rules. There's a reason this matters. When we assume that words must match something private, we run into confusion. We start thinking that people might mean something totally different when they say the same word. That leads to doubt, misunderstanding. But when we see that words gain meaning from use, not from hidden objects, things get clearer. No one needs to open the box. What matters is how people speak, how they react, how they learn the patterns. That's what gives words life, not the beetle inside. You walk into a room, you feel like you're aware of everything happening. You notice the light, the sound, the way your body feels in the chair. You might think you're getting a full picture of what's going on in your mind, but you're not. The blind brain hypothesis says that most of what your brain does is hidden from you. It works in the background, and what you experience is only a small slice. This isn't a strange idea when you think about how the rest of the body works. Your liver does its job without you knowing how. Your immune system fights off threats without asking your opinion. Your heart keeps beating while you sleep. The brain is more complex than any of these, yet we expect to know exactly what it's doing just because we're conscious. That assumption is the problem. Consciousness gives you the feeling of full access. It feels like you know what you think, want, and feel. It feels like your thoughts rise up into your awareness like water bubbling to the surface. But the blind brain hypothesis says that what you see is just what your brain is wired to show you. It doesn't give you the whole system. It gives you a simple, shaped version that you can manage. Think about your field of vision. You see what's in front of you, but your eyes skip over the spot where the optic nerve connects. That's your blind spot. Your brain fills it in so well you don't notice. It makes a guess based on the surrounding area. You walk around with a hole in your vision and you never see it. Now take that same idea and apply it to thoughts. You think your mind shows you everything it does, but it's filling in blanks. You're blind to the gaps. The blind brain hypothesis doesn't claim you're broken. It says the brain evolved to hide things from you. It works better when you don't know too much. If you saw every calculation, every hidden process, you'd freeze. You'd overthink your own decisions. Instead, the brain gives you a summary, a story, a feeling that you made a choice or had a thought, even when most of the work happened before you noticed. Let's say you're walking down the street and a dog barks. You jump. You don't think, that noise might mean danger, and then choose to react. You react first. Your brain processes the sound, assesses the risk, and triggers your body. After that, your awareness catches up. You might say, that scared me, but by then the reaction has already passed. Your conscious mind reports on something that already happened. This isn't rare. It happens all the time. You reach for a cookie and then think, I shouldn't eat that. But your hand moved before the thought. You start to say something, and only halfway through, realize it's the wrong thing. You decide to leave a party early, and then explain it with a reason that feels true, but may not be. You're always catching up to yourself. The hypothesis helps explain why you can be so confused about your own mind. You might say, I don't know why I feel this way, or I didn't mean to do that. You try to give reasons. You try to find patterns, but you're working with limited data. You're guessing, like someone trying to figure out how a machine works by watching just one blinking light. That doesn't mean introspection is useless. It means it's partial. You see the part of the iceberg above water and think it's the whole thing. The blind brain hypothesis says the real work happens in the dark. You get the finished product, not the assembly process. One area where this matters is the sense of self. You feel like you're a stable person with clear motives and values, but much of that comes from stories you tell yourself. The brain keeps a running narrative. It edits it as needed. If your actions don't match your image of yourself, it rewrites the script. You think, I had no choice, or I must have really cared. You smooth out contradictions after the fact. This is called confabulation. It happens in brain injury cases, but it also happens in everyday life. People misremember why they did things. They explain their behavior in ways that fit social norms or protect their identity. These aren't lies, they're best guesses. The brain fills in blanks to keep the story going. Even memory works this way. You don't store experiences like files. You reconstruct them when needed. You fill in gaps with likely details. You add things that make the story flow. You forget things that don't fit, and you believe the result because it feels complete. If the brain hides most of what it does, and if it shapes what you see, then your sense of clarity is built on an illusion. You're not aware of how much you're unaware. The gaps aren't marked. The seams are invisible. You move through life with the sense that you're steering the ship, even though most of the controls are below deck. Let's take decision-making. You might feel like you weigh the pros and cons, come to a reasoned conclusion, and act. But often, your brain makes a choice before you're aware of it. Studies using brain scans show that people's choices can be predicted seconds before they report deciding. This doesn't mean free will doesn't exist. It means your awareness of making a choice is delayed. You get the report after the event, not during it. The same goes for creativity. A writer might say, the idea just came to me, but it didn't come from nowhere. The brain was working in the background. It sorted through old memories, language patterns, and story structures. It built something new, then pushed it into awareness. The writer receives the idea like a gift, but the giver is hidden. The blind brain hypothesis isn't a claim that the brain lies. It's a claim that the brain filters. It shows you what you need to know to function, not what's true, not what's complete, but what works. That filter creates the illusion of full access. That illusion keeps you moving. Even your emotions pass through this system. You don't feel them raw. You feel them after they've been processed. You get a mix of body signals, thoughts, and context. You feel angry and then ask why. You feel sad and try to name the cause. But the emotion began before you noticed it. You're always chasing what already started. This also explains why people can hold beliefs that don't match their actions. The brain keeps different systems for behavior and explanation. You might say you believe in kindness and then act selfishly. You might claim you're calm while your body shows stress. The stories we tell don't always line up with what we do. None of this means people are hopeless or dishonest. It means the tools we use to understand ourselves are limited. We look at what the brain lets us see. We draw conclusions from the surface. The blind brain hypothesis says the rest is in the dark. The brain hides its own workings to make your life feel smooth. It leaves you with a clear picture of a world you only partly see. The idea of the Cartesian self begins with a man sitting alone by a fire, wondering what he can really know. His name is René Descartes. He decides to doubt everything he can. He doubts what he sees, what he hears, and even his own body. Maybe he is dreaming. Maybe some trickster is fooling him. But there is one thing he cannot doubt, the fact that he is doubting. To doubt, he must think. To think, he must exist. From this, he gets his most famous line, cogito ergo sum, I think, therefore I am. This seems simple, but it builds a picture of the self that has shaped a lot of Western thought. In Descartes' view, the self is a thinking thing, a mind, a subject. It stands apart from the body, the world, and other people. It knows itself through its own thoughts. It does not need proof from the outside. It does not need language or behavior. The self knows itself just by being aware of itself. That's the core of the Cartesian self, a private inner subject. A mind that exists even if everything else turns out to be false. Descartes thought this was the foundation for knowledge. If he could start with this one sure thing, he could build a system from it, like laying the first brick of a strong house. But this view creates some problems. If the self is separate from the body, how does it act in the world? How does it move the arms and legs? How do thoughts cause actions? Descartes said the mind and the body meet in the pineal gland, a small part of the brain. He believed this was the point where the thinking self could influence the body. But that answer didn't satisfy many people, even in his own time. There's another issue. If the self only knows itself through thinking, then what about the world outside the self? How can you be sure anything else exists? Maybe the fire, the table, the book, and even other people are illusions. This leads to solipsism, the idea that only your own mind can be known for sure. Let's bring this down to earth. Picture a person sitting alone in a room. The door is shut, no windows, no sounds from outside. She starts to ask, what can I be sure of? She looks at her hands. Could they be a dream? She hears a clock tick. Could it be a trick of the mind? She tries to strip away everything she can't know for sure. What's left? Only the fact that she is thinking. That's the only thing she can't doubt. In this moment, she becomes the Cartesian self, a bare mind. No body, no world, no others. Just a point of awareness. But people don't live this way. They don't walk around as pure minds. They live in bodies. They speak, they touch things, they laugh, they cry, they get sick, they grow old. The Cartesian self leaves all of that out. It treats the body like a machine the mind operates. It treats other people like uncertain shapes in a world that might not be real. That makes it hard to explain ordinary life. For example, how do children learn who they are? They don't do it by sitting and thinking. They learn through others. A child hears her name. She sees herself in a mirror. She is praised, corrected, held, and talked to. Her sense of self grows in a social space. It comes from interaction, not isolation. The Cartesian model also struggles with emotions. Descartes said emotions were movements of the soul caused by the body. But if the mind is separate from the body, why do feelings seem to involve both? When someone feels grief, their chest tightens. When someone is nervous, their stomach turns. It doesn't feel like a distant mind watching a broken machine. It feels like a whole person reacting to something real. Think about trust. Trust is not just a thought, it's a relationship. It's built through time, through action, through words and silence. The Cartesian self has no place for that. It stays alone, looking inward. But trust needs others. It needs bodies. It needs shared life. There's also the question of language. Descartes seemed to believe you could think without language, that the self could grasp its own being without words. But much of what we call thought takes place in language. We talk to ourselves in our heads. We name things. We form sentences. If we remove language, what kind of thinking is left? A vague sense of being? A flicker of awareness? Maybe that's enough to say, I am, but it's not enough to say much more. The Cartesian view suggests the self is self-evident, but many people don't feel that way. Some struggle to know who they are. Some feel split, some feel empty. Others feel too full, like they contain many selves. The idea that there is one clear, stable, thinking self doesn't match all experiences. Imagine someone with memory loss. They forget names, faces, even parts of their own life. Is their self still there? According to Descartes, yes. If they can still think, they still are. But that doesn't match what people around them might say. Family members might say, she's not the same person. They mean something more than just the ability to think. They mean the stories, the habits, the connections that made her who she was. That shows how the self is often tied to time, to memory, to others. It is not a point in the void. It is a pattern across days and years. It is built in speech, shaped by touch, reinforced by routine. The Cartesian self floats above all that, but real people don't. To call the self a thinking thing may be too thin. It leaves out too much. It cuts away the body, the senses, the relationships, and the social world. What's left might be true in a narrow way, but it's not the full picture. It's like seeing only the bones of a house and calling it a home. Yet Descartes' idea still lives on. It shows up when people say, I just need to figure things out in my head, or I need to find myself by thinking it through. It shows up in therapy, in education, in how we picture consciousness. The image of the lone thinker, separate from the world, still holds power. But the real self might be less like a point and more like a web. It stretches, it connects. It moves with time, it gets shaped by others. It lives in a body, in language, in place. The Cartesian self tries to stand outside all that, but most of the time we live right in the middle of it. A lab runs a test on a mouse. The mouse runs through a maze. It learns where the cheese is. The scientist writes down how fast the mouse solves the maze on day 1, then again on day 2, then again on day 3. Over time, the mouse gets better. The scientist sees this and writes a report about learning behavior. This is a physical experiment. It uses real mice, real mazes, and real food. Now take the same setup, but move it into a computer. The mouse is now a program. The maze is made of code. The cheese is a variable set as a goal. The mouse gets input about walls and paths, and its brain is an algorithm. It makes choices and changes its behavior based on the results. The scientist watches the program's output. They study how long it takes the simulated mouse to find the cheese. This is a conceptual experiment in silico. In silico means in silicon, or inside a computer. It's like in vitro and in vivo, which refer to experiments in glass or in living bodies. In silico experiments are not new, but they've become more common. They allow fast, repeatable tests. They don't need physical tools, animals, or people. They need code, memory, and processing power. Say someone wants to study how a virus spreads. In the past, they might have needed test subjects. Now, they can make a virtual city. They create agents, little programs that move like people. These agents have settings, how often they go out, how close they stand, how likely they are to wear masks. The virus is another bit of code, set to pass from one agent to another based on those settings. The program runs thousands of times with small changes each round. The scientist watches what happens. Patterns appear. Those patterns show how changes in behavior affect spread. No one gets sick. Nothing needs to be built. This type of experiment works best when the rules are known. If the model of behavior is close to the real thing, then the results can teach us something useful. But if the model is wrong, or if key factors are left out, then the results may mislead. A program that simulates people must make choices about what people do. Those choices shape the outcome. The scientist controls those assumptions. That makes the in silico experiment different from one done in the real world. In the real world, things go wrong. Machines break, people act in strange ways. In the computer, every rule is made by the person who writes the program. Nothing is left to chance unless chance is coded in. Consider a traffic simulation. A city planner wants to know if a new roundabout will help or hurt flow. They can make a digital map of the area. They code in cars, buses, stoplights. They set times for rush hour. They adjust how drivers behave, how fast they go, how they react to other cars. Then they add the roundabout. They run the model and compare the results to the old layout. They can run it again and again with slight changes. This costs less than digging up a road. It also gives early insight into whether the plan makes sense. These models are useful, but they are not neutral. Each one is shaped by choices. If the model says all drivers follow the rules, it will miss what happens when someone cuts across lanes. If it leaves out bad weather, It misses what happens in rain or snow. If it assumes cars are all the same, it misses how big trucks behave. These gaps mean the simulation can only be as good as the thinking behind it. That doesn't mean in silico experiments are flawed. It means they are specific tools. They let you test ideas before the stakes get high. They let you explore edge cases that might be rare in real life. They make it easier to try combinations that would be hard to set up in the real world. For example, a drug trial can't run every mix of dose and patient weight and age and other health conditions. But a model can try thousands of those mixes and show which ones are worth studying more. In neuroscience, a model brain might be used to test how different inputs change a neural network. You can build a system that mimics neurons firing. You can feed it signals and track what parts of the network light up. You can try it with damage in certain spots, like a stroke. You can test what happens when the signal path is slowed or blocked. You don't need to open a skull or harm a real brain. But again, it depends on the model. If the model is too simple or built on wrong ideas, it may not give useful answers. Some models test logic, not behavior. A group might design a rule system and test it in silico to see if it breaks. Take voting systems. You might write a model that simulates voters with different goals and beliefs. You set up different election systems: first past the post, ranked choice, approval voting. You run the election again and again to see how often each system leads to odd or unfair results. You don't need to run real elections. You need clear rules, good data on voter types, and a way to measure fairness. Models can also reveal what we don't know. If a simulation breaks down when a certain variable changes, that can point to a weak part in our understanding. A model of climate may behave well under normal conditions, but act strange when a key input is pushed past a threshold. That might mean the real system has risks we haven't seen yet. Even simple models can be helpful. A spreadsheet that projects future costs is an in silico experiment. It doesn't look like a lab test, but it runs scenarios. Change the cost of a part, see what happens to the total. Shift a date, watch the ripple. You don't need to build anything. You only need numbers and time. In silico work relies on abstraction. You pull out what you think are the key elements and let the rest go. You can't copy the full complexity of the real world. You aim for something close enough to guide thought. You get a tool to think with, not a mirror, but a map. A map leaves out trees, grass, clouds. It shows roads and borders. It helps you plan a route. You don't live inside the map, but you use it to move through the world. That's what an in silico model does. It shows what might happen, what could happen, and what probably won't. It runs fast without fatigue. It waits for input. It answers without judgment. That's useful. But you have to know what kind of question it can answer. A model doesn't care what's true. It only tells you what follows from its rules. If the rules are weak, the answers are weak. If the rules are sound, the answers can carry weight. In silico experiments can help shape policy, medicine, engineering, and even thought, but they sit between idea and action. They're not the final step. They're the part where you test what you think you know, then decide whether it's worth testing further. Outside the box. There's a field with a cow in it. A man looks across the field and sees the cow standing still. He says, "I know there's a cow in that field." Seems simple enough. But then you find out something. What the man saw was not a real cow, but a cardboard cutout of a cow. Someone had put it there as a prank. Still, there is a real cow in the field, hidden behind a tree. The man couldn't see it. He didn't know it was there. But he said there was a cow, and he was right. So did he really know there was a cow in the field? This story comes from a philosopher named Gettier. It's one of those examples meant to make you think twice about something that usually feels obvious. The man believed there was a cow. He had a reason for that belief, and he happened to be correct. Those three things, belief, justification, and truth, are what people often say knowledge requires. But this case feels off. It feels wrong to say the man knew there was a cow. He guessed right, but for the wrong reason. That's the core of the problem. If you're right, but only by chance, can you call it knowledge? Think about someone guessing the outcome of a football game. They say the Eagles will win. They don't follow the teams. They don't know who's injured or who's in form. They just like the name. The Eagles win. Was that knowledge? Or was it luck? The The man in the field saw a cow-shaped object and believed it was a cow. He used his eyes. He made a reasonable assumption. But his belief lined up with the truth by coincidence. If the real cow had walked off a minute earlier, he still would have said the same thing. His statement would have been false. That tells us something important. His belief was not tied to the truth in the right way. This example shows that knowledge is more than just guessing well. It's not enough to be right. You have to be right for the right reason. It helps to think of another example. A clock on the wall says 3. You look at it and believe it's 3. You check your watch and it also says 3. So far, so good. But later, you learn the wall clock has been stuck at 3 for days. You just happened to look at it at 3. Your belief was true. You had evidence, but your evidence was faulty. Again, your belief matched the truth, but not in the way that counts. You got lucky. This kind of luck is what philosophers call Gettier luck. It's when all the pieces of knowledge seem to be there: belief, reason, truth, but the reason doesn't connect to the truth in the way it should. The cow in the field example shows this clearly. The man's belief was based on something false. His visual evidence was fake. It was a cardboard cow. So even though there was a real cow, his method for reaching the truth didn't work. If someone asks, "How do you know there's a cow?" and you say, "I saw it," then you expect that what you saw was the cow. If what you saw was fake, then your belief, even if true, doesn't count as knowing. This matters in real life more than it seems. Imagine a doctor diagnosing a patient. The symptoms match a rare illness. The doctor makes the call and prescribes the right treatment. The patient gets better. Later, the doctor finds out the patient didn't have that illness at all. They had a different condition, but the same treatment worked. Was the doctor right? Was it knowledge? It was the right result, but not for the right reason. Or picture a teacher who thinks a student cheated on a test. The teacher checks the answers and sees they match another student's word for word. She accuses the student. Later, it turns out the student didn't cheat. They just happened to copy the answers from the board without realizing. The teacher's belief was false, even though it looked true. And if it had turned out the student had cheated, the belief would still be built on a weak foundation. These cases show why being right isn't enough. Knowledge needs a solid link between what you believe and why you believe it. The cow in the field shows that appearances can fool us. We trust what we see, but what we see can be shaped by chance, by trickery, or by bad timing. If the cow cutout hadn't been there, the man wouldn't have made the same claim. If he had looked in a different direction, he might not have believed there was a cow at all. Think about a weather app that says it's going to rain. You check it and bring an umbrella. It rains. You think, good thing I checked. But later, you learn the app was using old data. It was supposed to show sun. A bug in the system showed rain by mistake. You still stayed dry. But your belief in the forecast was right by luck, not by good reasoning. We don't often think this way in day-to-day life. We go with what seems reasonable. We rely on habits. But when we stop and examine how we know what we know, these edge cases start to matter. They show the cracks in the simple picture. The cow in the field reminds us to ask more than, is this true? We have to ask, why do I think it's true? And is that reason reliable? Otherwise, we confuse guessing with knowing. Philosophy uses stories like this not to confuse us, but to sharpen our thinking. It strips away the parts of life we take for granted and asks what's left. A man sees a cow. He says, there's a cow, he's right. But that's not the end of the story. The reason he's right matters. The way he got there matters. Without that, we're just tossing darts with our eyes closed and cheering when one hits the board. An espresso machine doesn't need to be complicated. It's a device that pushes hot water through compacted coffee grounds to make a small, strong drink. That's the basic idea. The machine heats the water, builds pressure, and forces the water through a puck of coffee. What comes out is thick, dark, and concentrated. People drink it in small amounts because it's dense. They might sip it as is, or add milk or water it down, but the machine's job is the same no matter the drink. Deliver water at the right pressure and temperature through a tight bed of ground coffee. Not all espresso machines are built the same. At the low end, some have no pump. They rely on steam pressure alone. These often fall short. Steam pressure isn't strong enough to make true espresso. The water isn't hot enough or fast enough. The result is usually bitter and weak. It tastes more like overbrewed drip coffee. It's strong, but not in the right way. True espresso machines use a pump. The pump builds pressure, ideally around 9 bars. That's about 9 times the pressure of the atmosphere. Enough to extract oils, acids, and sugars in balance. Enough to make that layer of foam on top, called crema. A basic home machine might have a small pump, a single boiler, and a portafilter. The portafilter is the handle with a basket. You pack the grounds in the basket, then you lock the portafilter into the group head, which is where the water comes out. Once everything's in place, you start the shot. Water moves from the boiler, through the grounds, and out the spouts. You'll need to grind your coffee. This part matters more than people think. The grind must be fine, but not powder. If the grind is too coarse, the water flows too fast. The shot comes out thin and sour. If it's too fine, the water struggles to get through. You end up with a slow, bitter shot, so the grinder matters. A burr grinder works better than a blade one. Burrs give you control over grind size. Blades chop unevenly. Next is tamping. Once the basket is full, you compress the grounds with a tamper. The goal is a level, even bed. Uneven tamping means water finds the weak spots. That's called channeling. Water rushes through the path of least resistance. The coffee doesn't extract evenly. You get a mix of sour and bitter, but not the good parts. A firm, level tamp helps. You don't need to crush it. Just apply steady pressure and keep the puck flat. Temperature matters too. The water should be around 90 to 96 degrees Celsius. Too hot, and you burn the coffee. Too cool, and you under-extract. Many machines keep it close, but not all. Some machines fluctuate. You might notice the first shot tastes good, but the next one doesn't. That's often a heat issue. A single boiler can't heat fast enough for back-to-back shots. Dual boiler machines fix that. One heats water for brewing, the other heats water for steaming milk. That way, both stay at the right temperature. If you want to steam milk, the machine needs a steam wand. It pulls steam from the boiler and pushes it through a small nozzle. The nozzle aerates the milk. You get microfoam, tiny bubbles mixed evenly. This takes some practice. If you leave the tip too high, you get big bubbles. Too low, and you just heat the milk. The sweet spot is just under the surface. You listen for a soft hissing sound, not a scream. You tilt the pitcher to spin the milk. That blends the foam into the liquid. The goal is something smooth and glossy, not frothy or dry. Let's go back to the espresso shot. A good shot takes about 25 to 30 seconds from the moment you start the pump. You're aiming for about 25 to 30 grams of liquid, from 18 to 20 grams of dry coffee. That's a ratio close to 1:2. It's called a brew ratio. If the shot runs faster than that, it's under-extracted. If it runs slower, it's over-extracted. You can adjust by changing the grind, the dose, or the tamp. Some machines let you adjust pressure or temperature too, but that's more advanced. Cleaning matters. Old grounds clog the basket, oils build up on the group head, milk dries in the steam wand. A dirty machine makes bad coffee. You should flush the group head before and after each shot. Wipe the steam wand right after use. Backflush the machine with water every few days and with detergent every week if you use it daily. Replace water filters if the machine has one. Descale it every few months, more often if your water is hard. Now consider the materials. A cheap machine might have a plastic portafilter and thin metal parts. These don't hold heat well. They cool down fast. That affects shot quality. A heavy brass or stainless steel group head keeps heat stable. So does a solid portafilter. Heavier machines vibrate less. They feel more stable. That doesn't make the coffee taste better by itself, but it helps consistency. You don't want your portafilter shaking loose during the shot. Water quality matters more than people expect. Tap water can work, but if it's hard or chlorinated, it affects taste. It also builds scale in the boiler. Filtered water is safer. Don't use distilled water. Machines with sensors need minerals to detect water flow. Distilled water has none. Some machines include test strips or guides for water quality. Follow them. It saves time and money later. Some machines come with preset programs. You press a button and get a shot. That can be fine, but it means you give up control. If the shot runs fast or slow, you can't do much unless you adjust the grind or dose. Manual machines give more feedback. You start and stop the shot. You feel how the portafilter locks in. You see how the shot flows. That teaches you what's right and what's wrong. Pressure profiling is another feature. That's when the machine changes pressure during the shot. It might start slow to saturate the puck, then build pressure, then ease off at the end. This mimics how lever machines work. It gives you more control over extraction. Not every coffee needs it, but some benefit. Lighter roasts, for example, often taste better with a gentle pre-infusion. Older cafes used lever machines. The barista pulled down a spring-loaded lever that sent water through the grounds. These machines required skill. You had to feel the pressure. Now, pump-driven machines do the same job, but with less effort. Lever machines still exist, and some people prefer them. They give a tactile connection. You feel the shot, but they take practice. The machine doesn't work alone. The grinder, the beans, the water, and the user all matter. A good grinder makes a bigger difference than people think. A bad grinder ruins good beans. Fresh coffee helps too. Espresso uses coffee roasted within a few weeks. Too fresh, and the gas inside causes uneven extraction. Too old, and it tastes flat. Store beans in a dry, airtight container. Don't freeze them unless you know how to do it right. There's no one way to make espresso. Each machine has limits. Each user makes choices. Some want speed, others want control. Some want a good cappuccino in the morning. Others want to dial in single origin beans. Either way, the basics don't change. Grind right, tamp evenly, extract at the right pressure and temperature, and clean the machine. Everything else builds on that. The idea of an all-powerful, all-knowing, all-good God is familiar. It's what many people think of when they hear the word God. This God created the world, watches over it, and wants what's best for us. When bad things happen, wars, disease, suffering, we're told there's a reason. We don't always understand the reason, but it's there. God is good, so even if things look terrible, we're supposed to trust that it makes sense in the bigger picture. Now consider a different version. Same power, same knowledge, but not good. This God is evil. He created the world, but his goal is to cause suffering. He wants people to hurt. He builds systems where things look like they might work out just to pull them apart. He gives hope and then crushes it. He allows love and joy, but only so their loss will sting more. He's smart enough to do all of this in ways that make it hard to tell what's going on. This is the evil God challenge. It asks, if it's unreasonable to believe in an evil God, why isn't it also unreasonable to believe in a good one? The question comes from philosopher Stephen Law. He doesn't claim an evil God exists. He's not saying we should believe in one. He's asking why we treat the idea of a good God as serious and reasonable, but laugh off the idea of an evil one. The two gods are symmetrical. Both are all-powerful. Both know everything. Both create the world. The only difference is their moral character. One wants good, the other wants evil. If we think an evil God is silly or unbelievable, we have to explain why the good one isn't. Many people try to defend belief in a good God by pointing to good things in the world. There's beauty, kindness, love. People help each other. Sunsets are beautiful. Music lifts us up. That sort of thing. These are offered as signs of a good God. But someone defending belief in an evil God could say the same, just in reverse. They could point to all the bad things: cancer, abuse, earthquakes, war. They might say those show the true nature of the God in charge. If someone argues, but there's also good in the world, the believer in an evil God could answer, of course there is. An evil God would allow some good, just enough to make the bad things hurt more. That line of reasoning works both ways. Defenders of a good God often say that suffering is needed for greater goods. They might say we need hardship to build character, or that people grow through pain, or that freedom means people can choose evil. These are called theodicies, ways to explain why a good God allows evil. But the believer in an evil God could offer reverse theodicies. Maybe joy is allowed so that people have more to lose. Maybe freedom is needed so people can choose to hurt each other. Maybe false hope is the best way to increase suffering. A clever and evil God would use happiness to make the pain worse. The challenge is to show why these explanations work for a good God, but not for an evil one. It's not enough to say, that's just how I feel, or that's what I believe. The question is about reason. If we say an evil God is absurd because the world has some good in it, then why don't we say a good God is absurd because the world has so much evil in it? Let's take a closer look at suffering. People die in floods, fires, and famines. Children get diseases that slowly destroy their bodies. Families live in war zones for decades. If a good God allows all this, we need a strong reason. Some say it's because of original sin, or because of free will, or because it leads to soul-making. But these answers don't always seem strong enough. The reverse argument says, this suffering fits better with an evil God. If the goal is to cause as much pain as possible while keeping people from giving up completely, the world looks just right. Let people think they can escape suffering, then drop more of it on them. Let a baby be born, let the parents feel joy, then take the child away. That's cruelty at a high level. One pushback is that the world doesn't look designed for maximum suffering. There's too much beauty, too much joy. People fall in love. Art exists. Animals play. Music moves people. A truly evil God, someone might say, would stamp all of that out. But that misses the point. A clever evil God wouldn't make everything terrible. He would give people moments of peace, then snatch them away. The happiness would serve the pain. A day of sunshine makes the storm that follows feel worse. A lifetime of health makes a sudden illness more brutal. An evil God wouldn't make the world purely awful. He'd make it mixed, so the hope always gets crushed. Others might say that an evil God would destroy everything, but that's not clear either. Destruction ends suffering. It brings final rest. If a God really wanted people to suffer, he wouldn't kill them all off at once. He'd let them live long enough to feel loss, fear, guilt, and grief. He'd build long stories with tragic endings. That's much more effective. The idea of a good God gets more sympathy because it fits better with how we want the world to be. People want comfort. They want to believe that things will work out. Belief in a good God helps with that. It offers meaning in suffering. It tells people their lives matter. But that comfort doesn't prove the belief is true. It only shows that it feels good. The Evil God Challenge tries to strip that comfort away and look at the logic underneath. If we say that it's irrational to believe in an evil God because the world has too much good, then we also need to ask if belief in a good God is irrational because the world has too much evil. The symmetry holds. Each side can make the same kinds of excuses, use the same tricks of logic, and appeal to the same mysterious plans. If one version doesn't work, the other shouldn't either. If the evil God doesn't make sense, then maybe the good one doesn't either. Not without better reasons than we've been given so far. That's the weight of the challenge. Not to say there is no God, or that belief is silly, but to hold the idea of a good God to the same standard we use for other claims. If we'd laugh off the idea of an all-powerful evil God, then we have to explain why we don't treat the good one the same way. We can't have it both ways without showing where the line is and why it matters. You're driving through the countryside. You see a red barn on the right side of the road. It's big, with clean paint and a white X across the doors. You nod and think, that's a barn. You keep driving. Every few miles you see another one. Same color, same size, same look. They seem too perfect. Later, someone tells you this. Most of the barns you saw weren't real. They were just fronts. Built to look like barns from one side, but hollow behind. Just walls held up by scaffolding. They're called fake barns. You're surprised. But it makes you wonder, if you believe there was a barn and it looked like one, does it matter that it wasn't real? This example comes from a problem in epistemology, the study of knowledge. Philosophers use it to test what counts as knowing something. It goes like this. Say you point at a red barn and say, there's a barn. You're right, there is one. But you're in fake barn country. All around are structures that only look like barns. They're not buildings, they're just props. By chance, you happen to point at the one real barn. Now the question, do you know it's a barn? You believed it was. You had a good reason. You saw it with your own eyes. It looked like a barn, and it was one. But if most of the things that look like barns around you aren't real, then your belief could easily have been false. You just got lucky. That luck calls into question whether your belief counts as knowledge. To count as knowledge, a belief needs to be more than true. It needs to be formed in the right way. You can't just guess and get it right. You need to have a reliable method, a solid basis. If the method you used would just as easily have led you wrong, then even if you got it right, something's missing. That's what the fake barn scenario shows. Your eyesight worked fine. You weren't hallucinating. You weren't being tricked, but the environment was misleading. You were surrounded by fakes. You had no way to tell them apart from the real thing. You pointed to the real one by chance. So while your belief was true, it wasn't safe. That makes it hard to say you knew it. This idea matters because it shows that knowledge depends on more than just getting the facts right. It depends on how you got there. The context matters. The reliability of your surroundings matters. If your method would have failed in most nearby cases, then your success feels accidental. It doesn't carry the weight of knowledge. It helps to look at another example. Say you walk into a museum. You see what looks like a famous painting. You believe it's the original. You read the label, you recognize the image, and you're right, it is the original. But what if the museum is filled with high-quality fakes? What if most of the pieces that look like originals aren't? Then even though your belief is true, it comes from a fragile method, one that would often lead you wrong in that setting. That makes your belief feel unstable. Or say you're in a city where there are lots of fake police officers, people dressed in uniform but not trained, not authorized. You meet someone in uniform and you believe they're a real officer. And they are. But if most people in uniforms in that city aren't real officers, your belief isn't formed in a safe way. You happen to get it right, but only by chance. That weakens the claim that you knew. The fake barn case forces a split between belief, truth, and knowledge. It shows that you can believe something and be right, but still not know it. That breaks with the old idea that knowledge is just justified, true belief. The fake barn case shows how justification can fall short when the environment isn't trustworthy. Some philosophers say what matters is the safety of your belief. A belief is safe if, in most close situations, it would still be true. In fake barn country, that's not the case. In most nearby worlds, where you look at a different barn or drive a few miles further, your belief would be false. So even though in this world you got it right, your method isn't safe. That's why some say you didn't really know. Others try to push back. They say if your senses are working and you're not being deceived, you should count as knowing. It's not your fault you're in a tricky environment. But that doesn't change the fact that your belief was shaped by chance, not by a method that usually leads to truth. There's also the question of how this applies to daily life. Most people don't worry about whether they're in fake barn country. They trust their senses. They assume the world isn't filled with props and tricks. But in some fields, like eyewitness testimony or scientific research, the difference matters. If a witness picks someone out of a lineup in a way that would often lead them wrong, we question their reliability. If a test result comes from a method that gives false positives in many nearby cases, we look for a better test. This also plays into how we think about luck. Not all luck ruins knowledge. Sometimes luck helps you avoid harm or win a prize. But when luck is the only thing that makes your belief true, it feels wrong to call it knowledge. It feels like you rolled the dice and got lucky, not like you understood or knew the truth. Fake barn cases don't show up in the real world as often as they do in philosophy books, but the structure behind them does. They make us ask how much our environment affects what we think we know. They remind us that knowing something isn't just about what's in our head. It's also about what's around us and how easily we could have been wrong. It's easy to say, I know what I saw, but if you're standing in fake barn country, that confidence may be misplaced. You're using a method that works in normal settings, but not here. That gap between how things seem and how they are is what makes these cases interesting. They show how thin the line can be between knowing and guessing, even when you feel sure, even if the barn is real, even if you're right. If you got there by chance, you're not standing on solid ground. A man floats in the air. He has no senses, no sight, no sound, no smell, no taste, no touch. His arms do not touch his sides. His legs do not press against each other. There is no ground beneath him. There is no wind or warmth. No light enters his mind. He has no memory of having a body. He has no way to reach the outside world. Yet in this state, he says to himself, I exist. This thought experiment comes from the philosopher Ibn Sina, often known in the West as Avicenna. He used it to explore the nature of the self. He wanted to show that the self, or the soul, does not depend on the body to know that it exists. You can take away everything, every physical sense, every experience, every object, and the self still remains. At least it does for him. He called this the floating man. The point is not whether a person can actually float in air with no senses. The point is that we can think of it. We can picture a mind cut off from all input, yet still aware that it is. And that awareness, in his view, is proof that the self exists apart from the body. It's not made of bone or blood or skin. It's not an object you can point to. It's something you know from the inside. Some philosophers agree with this. They say that the self is simple, not in the sense of being easy, but in the sense of not being made of parts. The body has parts, arms, lungs, cells. A house has parts, walls, floors, windows. But the self, they say, does not. It cannot be broken down, it cannot be split, it just is. And even if all the senses go away, even if you can't remember anything, the I still shows up. Others disagree. They say that without the body, there is no self. They point out that people change when the brain changes. A head injury can erase memory. A stroke can change personality. A disease can take away language. If the self were separate, they ask, why would damage to the body change it so much? In this view, the self is a function of the brain. It comes from the parts working together. No brain, no self. Back to the floating man. He floats alone, cut off from the world. He has no way to compare what he is to anything else. He cannot say what shape he is, what size he is, or even if he is in time. But he still thinks. And that thinking matters. It shows that something is there. Even if he is wrong about what he is, even if he imagines a self that doesn't match what's real, the fact that he can imagine at all is a sign of being. This idea connects with another famous line from philosophy, I think, therefore I am. That comes from René Descartes. He also tried to find something that could not be doubted. He said you can doubt the world, your senses, even your memories, but you cannot doubt that you are doubting. And if you doubt, you think. And if you think, you are. Ibn Sina came before Descartes. He had a different background, different terms, different goals, but both used the mind as a place to begin. Both said that the self, at least in some form, does not depend on the outside world to exist. They saw the mind not as a blank slate waiting for input, but as something with its own light, even when no windows are open. Now think of someone in a sensory deprivation tank. They float in warm water. The room is silent. The light is off. Their ears are covered. Their eyes are closed. After a while, some people report feeling like they no longer have a body. They don't feel their arms, their legs, their back. It all fades, but they still think. They still say, I'm here. They don't vanish. That experience might not be as complete as the floating man, but it points in the same direction. We can also look at dreams. In a dream, you can exist without knowing where you are or what you are. You might be a child again. You might be someone else. You might have no body at all. But you still experience something. There's still a point of view. You can wake up and say, I was there in the dream. Even if everything in the dream was made up, the I remained present. The floating man raises questions we still ask. Is the self the same as the brain? Can it exist without the body? What is the core of a person? Is it memory, thought, awareness, or something else? These questions don't have easy answers, but they help us see the parts we often take for granted. Think of someone who loses all memory. They forget their name, their family, their past. Are they still the same person? In some ways, no. They don't remember who they loved or what they did. But in other ways, yes. They still feel. They still know what it is to be afraid, or to enjoy music, or to be lonely. Something persists, or takes someone in a coma. They don't speak. They don't respond. But brain scans show activity. We don't know what, if anything, they experience. But if they wake up, many say they had dreams or thoughts or sensations they couldn't express. That suggests the I can survive even long silence. Some people say that the self is just a story the brain tells, that there is no single solid I, only a stream of thoughts, a series of pictures and voices. From this view, the floating man is mistaken. There is no core. There is no light in the dark, only the illusion of one. But even if that's true, the story still has a narrator. Something holds the pieces together. Something watches the thoughts, even if it is also made of them. You can try this yourself. Close your eyes, cover your ears, sit still, let go of your name, your job, your memories. Try to imagine what it would be like to float in the dark with nothing to feel, see, or remember. What remains? Is it blank, or is there still something that knows it is there? The floating man might not tell us what the self is, but it shows that the question matters, that even with nothing else, the question remains. What am I? What is this thing that knows, even in silence? Somewhere in the dark, a man floats. He cannot reach out, he cannot fall, he cannot hear his own breath, he cannot tell how long he has been there, but he knows one thing: he is. Love isn't one thing. People use the word in many ways. You can love a pet, love your brother, love a friend, love a country, love your job, or love a partner. The same word works in all those cases, but the meaning shifts each time. C.S. Lewis broke this down into 4 kinds of love: affection, friendship, eros, and charity. Each one has its own shape and role. They can overlap, but they don't replace one another. Affection is the base layer. It grows from familiarity. A mother rocking her baby at night, a dog waiting by the door, a boy who always plays in the same tree. These are all signs of affection. It doesn't begin with a choice. It shows up over time, built from habit and shared space. You might not even notice it at first. You just find comfort in the presence of someone or something. This kind of love isn't glamorous. It doesn't need words or declarations. A father packing lunch every morning, a teacher staying late to help one student, a neighbor who brings soup when someone's sick. These are quiet acts. There's no performance in them. Affection can feel ordinary. That's part of its strength. It makes space for others to exist close by without always needing attention. But affection has limits. It can become stale or clingy. A parent might smother a child in the name of love. A pet owner might treat an animal like a person and ignore what the animal actually needs. When affection stops seeing the other clearly, it becomes a kind of shadow love, still present, but warped. Friendship works differently. It grows not from closeness in space, but from closeness in interest. 2 people love the same thing, and that love pulls them toward each other. This might be a shared hobby, a common belief, or a way of seeing the world. They don't face each other, trying to connect. They stand side by side, looking at the same object or goal. Friendship can take time to spot. In a group, you might notice 2 people always sit next to each other or always fall into the same rhythm during a task. They might not say, "We're close," but they seek each other out because of what they share. There's a freedom to friendship. It doesn't carry the weight of duty like family ties often do. Friends choose each other, and they can choose to part ways. That's why it needs attention. If ignored, it can fade. If used as a tool, say for influence or gain, it stops being friendship. One of the marks of real friendship is ease. There's no need to impress. Silence isn't awkward. Laughter doesn't have to be explained. A shared look can say enough. But just like affection, friendship can turn. A tight-knit group can close itself off. Friends can become possessive or form alliances that leave others out. At its worst, friendship can feel like a club with hidden rules. Eros is what most people think of when they hear the word love. It's romantic, emotional, often sexual. But Lewis drew a line between eros and simple desire. Desire wants a body. Eros wants a person. It doesn't just say, "I want this." It says, "I want you." It turns towards someone in full attention. The world narrows. The other becomes the center. This kind of love is powerful. It can drive people to take risks, leave home, write poems, change jobs. It doesn't always follow reason. In its best form, it lifts both people out of themselves. But because it's strong, it can also be dangerous. It can become jealous, obsessive, or blind. It can make people forget their values or ignore warning signs. When Eros grows without honesty, it can become a trap. Eros also can't hold everything. It flares, then fades. The bond needs more than passion to last. It needs respect, patience, shared habits. It has to settle into something steadier, something more like affection and friendship, to survive over time. The last kind of love is charity. Lewis used the Greek word agape. This love doesn't grow from need or likeness. It gives without asking in return. It sees the other person as worthy, even when they don't give anything back. A man who forgives someone who wronged him. A woman who cares for a sick parent who no longer remembers her name. A person who shows kindness to a stranger. These all carry the weight of charity. This love asks more. It doesn't rely on feeling. In fact, it often shows up when feelings are absent or even against it. It says, I will act in love toward you, even when the heart is tired, even when the other has failed. Charity doesn't mean liking everyone. It doesn't mean staying in harm's way. It means choosing to value others even when there's no gain. That makes it rare. It's not showy. It doesn't need praise. It often happens in private moments, unseen. When charity mixes with the other loves, it strengthens them. Affection becomes more patient. Friendship becomes more generous. Eros becomes more steady. Without charity, the other loves risk turning inward. They can become about comfort or pride or possession. With charity, they open outward. They remember the worth of the other person. You might see all 4 kinds of love in a single relationship. A long marriage might begin with eros and grow into friendship, marked by steady affection and acts of charity. A parent-child bond might carry affection and charity from the start, then shift into friendship as the child becomes an adult. Not every relationship holds all 4. That's not failure. It just means different bonds serve different roles. In daily life, these loves show up in plain forms. A friend drops off groceries. A spouse listens without interrupting. A child hugs a parent after a long day. A worker stands up for a teammate. A volunteer drives someone to the doctor. These acts don't always feel deep, but they add up. They shape how people live together. Each kind of love has a place. Each one meets a different human need. They aren't in competition. They don't fight for space. They work best when they support one another. When they do, love becomes more than a word. It becomes a practice, a way of being, something people do again and again, even when it's hard, even when it's quiet. Further facts don't always settle the matter. In some cases, they confuse it. People often treat facts like weights on a scale, pile up enough and the answer tips into view. But it doesn't always work that way. Facts don't speak for themselves. They need context, language, and a point of view. Otherwise, they sit there, present but undecided. Think of a courtroom. Both sides bring facts. One side says the defendant was at the scene. They show footage. The other side says the video's timestamp is wrong. They have phone records. Both sides have facts. The outcome depends on how those facts get arranged, what they're made to mean, and which version of the story fits with the rest of what people already accept. The facts are raw material. They don't explain themselves. Take weather forecasting. A person sees 3 cloudy days in a row. They say it's going to rain. That's a guess based on a pattern. A meteorologist uses barometric pressure, satellite images, humidity levels. Those are more facts. But even then, the forecast is a judgment. It might say 80% chance of rain. The number feels precise, but it still allows room for dry skies. The forecast is a decision built on facts. It's not a fact itself. Now think about someone who says, I'm not feeling well. You ask what's wrong. They say, I have a headache and I'm tired. Those are facts in one sense. They're reports from their own body. But they aren't the whole picture. The same symptoms could mean stress, a cold, dehydration, or a long night. More facts, temperature, blood pressure, recent activity might help, or they might not. The person's sense of feeling unwell came first. The facts try to support or explain that. They follow the experience. They don't cause it. Sometimes people collect facts to win an argument. They gather links, studies, numbers, quotes. They bring them out one after another. It's a way to overwhelm. But stacking facts doesn't prove much if the other person doesn't share your framing. 2 people can look at the same set of data and draw opposite conclusions. Not because one is lying, but because they see different things as important. They filter through different lenses. They start with different beliefs. Here's a simpler case. A man walks into a coffee shop and sees someone reading a book. The person wears headphones. The man waves. The person doesn't respond. The man feels snubbed. Fact, he waved. Fact, the other person didn't look up. But what do those facts mean? If he finds out the headphones were playing loud music, that changes things. If he finds out the person saw him but ignored him, that's something else. The facts stay the same, but their meaning shifts depending on new information. Interpretation drives the reaction, not the facts alone. Consider history. 2 countries write different versions of the same war. Both include dates, battles, losses. Both draw from documents and photographs. But one calls it a war of liberation. The other calls it an invasion. Same events, different stories. Facts don't fix that. The framing, the purpose of the telling, and the audience all shape how the facts are used. There's a phrase that says, "The map is not the territory." A fact is like a dot on a map. It shows something, but only a part. It doesn't explain the terrain, the weather, the travel time. It doesn't show what's hidden under trees or inside buildings. It's helpful, but limited. You need many dots and a sense of how they connect. Even then, you don't get the land itself. You get a version. In science, facts come from measurement. You weigh, time, count. But measurements depend on instruments. Instruments can break or give false readings. More importantly, someone has to decide what to measure. That choice is shaped by theory. You measure what you think matters. That brings in human judgment. Even in hard science, facts don't come pure. They come wrapped in assumptions. Imagine a classroom. A student fails a test. Fact, the score is 50%. What does that mean? It might mean the student didn't study, or didn't understand, or was sick, or the test was poorly written. The number is clear, but the meaning isn't. It needs more than the fact to be useful. This doesn't mean facts don't matter, they matter a lot. But they don't carry their own message. They don't float free from use. They don't settle arguments by themselves. They support stories, and stories come from people. People pick which facts to notice, which to ignore, which to connect. You see this in journalism. A report might list facts from a government statement. Then it lists facts from a protester. Both sets can be true, but the article still needs a structure. It still needs an angle. Even if it says it's neutral, it chose what to include. That's already a kind of leaning. Leaving out is as powerful as putting in. In daily life, people use facts as shields. I'm just stating the facts, they say, to sound objective. But picking which facts to state is already subjective. It's a choice. Saying she was late 3 times is factual. Leaving out that her train was delayed is also a choice. Both things can be true, but which one gets said shapes the story. Some people treat facts as bricks, stack them, and you get truth. But facts don't build anything without mortar. The mortar is meaning. It's the glue of context, values, and purpose. Without that, you just have a pile. Even in personal relationships, facts often get used the wrong way. One partner says, "You said you'd be home at 6." The other says, "I was." But the tone, the pause, the way the door shut, all those unspoken things also count. The fact of being on time might not settle the mood. The feeling of being distant or distracted might override it. People don't argue only about what happened. They argue about what it meant. You can see the same pattern in law. A law might say, "No vehicles in the park." That seems simple, but is a wheelchair a vehicle? What about a toy car? An ambulance? The fact of being a vehicle isn't enough. You need interpretation. You need to apply the rule in a setting that always brings human judgment into it. In technology, numbers get thrown around like facts: download speed, screen resolution, megapixels. But numbers only matter in use. A phone can have the highest specs and still feel slow. A camera can have more megapixels and still take worse pictures in low light. Specs are facts. Performance is experience. The first doesn't always guarantee the second. Further facts might help, but they can also lead you in circles. You can keep asking for more data, more proof, more studies. At some point, you still have to make a decision. You still have to act. Facts can guide. They don't decide. People often say, "Let's stick to the facts to keep things clean." But sticking to the facts doesn't mean avoiding conflict. It doesn't mean reaching the same conclusions. It just means choosing a certain way to frame the conversation. Even then, there's no escape from context. So more facts might fill the picture or blur it. It depends on what you're looking for, how you see it, and what you believe connects it. Facts support. They don't replace thinking. They don't eliminate judgment. They never work alone. A man walks through the forest with a local guide. They don't speak the same language. As they pass a clearing, a rabbit darts out from behind a bush. The local points and says, "Gavagai." The visitor makes a note. He thinks he has learned the local word for rabbit. That's the start of a famous problem from philosopher Willard Van Orman Quine. It looks like a simple translation. A word is spoken in the presence of something. The visitor assumes the word refers to the animal, but there's a gap between hearing the word and knowing what it means. Gavagai might mean rabbit, but it might also mean a stage of rabbit or undetached rabbit parts. It could mean look, food, or quick, catch it. It might even mean rabbit again if the guide has seen many that day. The visitor sees a rabbit, hears Gavagai, and connects the two. But that connection rests on a guess. This is the problem of indeterminacy of translation. Even with context, there's no clear way to lock a word to one meaning. Many interpretations can fit the same evidence. The guide sees the rabbit and reacts. The visitor hears the word and builds a theory. But that theory could be wrong. And if it's wrong, there's no obvious sign. Everything might still work. This isn't just about rabbits or made-up words. It cuts into how we understand any language. Suppose you hear someone say bank. Do they mean the edge of a river or the place that holds money? The word by itself doesn't tell you. You need context. You need background knowledge. Even then, mistakes happen. People often think they've understood when they haven't. In the Gavagai case, the context seems strong. A rabbit appears. A word is spoken. But that's not enough. Suppose the guide believes in spirits. He might be saying rabbit spirit, or he might mean omen, or be careful. The visitor, unaware of the local beliefs, assumes the word is tied to the animal. That's a natural guess. It might also be wrong. Now imagine the visitor builds a dictionary. He writes, Gavagai equals rabbit. He uses it to translate sentences. The translations make sense. People nod or respond in ways that seem right. But again, there's no clear test that proves the dictionary is correct. It just has to work well enough. This is Queen's point. Translation depends on use, not truth. Take another case. A mother tells her child, that's hot, pointing to a stove. The child learns the word hot. At first, they might use it for anything warm, a bath, the sun, even a spicy pepper. Later, they learn the limits. They learn when hot fits and when it doesn't. But there's no moment where they see the word match a pure, isolated meaning. They learn through feedback, not definitions. The Gavagai problem shows how even basic words can shift. The visitor can never step outside the situation to check the real meaning. He works from patterns, from behavior, from reactions. That's all language ever gives us. We guess, we test, we adjust, but we don't get certainty. You might think this only applies to foreign languages, but the same thing happens within a single language. Think about how people use the word love. One person says, I love you, and means deep commitment. Another says it after 2 dates. A third uses it for a pet, or a song, or a meal. The word stays the same, but the meaning moves. We understand by tone, timing, history, not by looking inside the word. Now think about a courtroom. A witness says he threatened me. The word threaten matters. It could mean a physical gesture. It could mean harsh words. It could mean silence with a certain look. Lawyers argue over the meaning. They bring in context. They try to show what the word meant in that moment. But even with recordings, even with careful notes, the core of the word stays open. There's no final definition that fits every case. Quine wasn't saying we should give up on meaning. He was showing how flexible it is. We think we can lock a word to a thing, but language doesn't work that way. Words point. They suggest, they carry habits and history, but they don't come with built-in meanings. This also affects science. Scientists build theories in language. They measure, they describe, they predict. But their terms shift too. Think about gene. In one era, it meant a stretch of DNA that codes for a protein. Later, it included regulatory parts. Now some talk about gene networks. The word grows as knowledge grows, but that means older uses can become unclear. Or take mass. In everyday talk, it means weight. In physics, it means resistance to acceleration. Then there's relativistic mass, which changes with speed. The same word moves between frames. If we asked a scientist to define mass in one way for all time, they couldn't. The meaning depends on use, on model, on context. Back in the forest, the visitor keeps building his notes. He adds new words: tree, run, danger. Each one comes from events: a fall, a chase, a shout. He builds rules, makes sentences, tests them, but he can never be sure he got it right. He only knows the system works. People seem to understand him. They respond. That's the point. Language works not because we match words to pure meanings, but because we share patterns. We nod, we point, we act, we correct each other. We train children. We react to mistakes. Over time, the system holds, not through certainty, but through practice. Queen used Gavagai to show that there's always more than one way to make sense of language. Even with all the data in the world, two people might build two different translations. Both could work. Both could be consistent, but they wouldn't match word for word. That's not a flaw. It's how language operates. You can't pin down every term. Even if you ask a speaker to explain, they'll just give you more words. Those words will need context too. The chain never ends. Meaning doesn't sit inside the word. It moves with use. This doesn't mean language is useless. It means it's alive, flexible, based on habits, not rules carved in stone. The visitor in the forest gets along fine. He trades, he warns, he asks for help. His words work because people agree, for now, on what they mean. If something changes, the language will shift. New words will come, old ones will fade. Gavagai reminds us that language always reaches beyond the surface. A word is not a fixed label. It's part of a stream of life, a tool we sharpen by using, not something we see once and understand forever. You believe something, it's true, and you have a reason for believing it. For a long time, that was enough. Philosophers called this justified true belief. If your belief was true, and if you had a good reason for it, then it counted as knowledge. That's how things stood for centuries. Then Edmund Gettier came along. In 1963, he wrote a short paper, just a few pages, that changed the conversation. He gave a couple of simple cases. In each one, a person had a belief that was justified and true, but something about it didn't feel like knowledge. That's the heart of what we now call the Gettier problem. Take this example. Smith and Jones are both applying for a job. Smith has strong evidence that Jones will get the job. The company told him Jones was the top candidate. Smith also saw Jones empty his pocket and count 10 coins. Based on this, Smith forms the belief, the person who will get the job has 10 coins in his pocket. Now here's the twist. Smith ends up getting the job. Unknown to him, he also has 10 coins in his pocket. He just never counted them. So his belief that the person who will get the job has 10 coins is true. It's also justified. But it seems like he got lucky. His belief was right, but for the wrong reason. That's what makes it a Gettier case. The belief is true. The justification is there. But there's a gap between the justification and the truth. It feels like the truth came in by accident. Here's another one. You look at a clock. It says 2. You believe it's 2. The clock is working, the lighting is good, and everything seems normal. You check your phone later and find out it really is 2. But then you learn the clock has been broken for 2 days. It stopped at 2 and hasn't moved since. You just happened to look at it at the exact right time. Your belief was true. You had a reason to believe it. But the reason wasn't actually tied to the truth. It was a lucky guess dressed up as knowledge. These cases feel off. That's why Gettier's challenge hit so hard. If we want to say that knowledge is more than just a true belief with justification, we have to find something else that's missing. Otherwise, we're stuck saying someone knows something even when the truth shows up by coincidence. Some tried to fix the problem by adding conditions. One idea was to say that your belief can't be based on false steps. In the Smith and Jones case, Smith's belief came from the idea that Jones would get the job. That was false. So maybe if you want real knowledge, your reasoning has to stay clean from start to finish. But that doesn't solve every case. You can have all true steps and still land in the same kind of trap. Suppose a farmer sees what looks like a sheep in a field. He believes there's a sheep in that field. He's right, there is a sheep lying in the tall grass. But what he saw wasn't the real sheep. It was a dog that just happens to look like a sheep from far away. His belief is true. He had a reason for it. But again, it feels like he got lucky. Another move was to talk about reliable processes. This is the idea that your belief comes from a method that usually works. For example, using your eyes to judge what's in front of you, or checking the time on a working clock. If the method is reliable and you use it in the right way, then maybe that helps block Gettier-style luck. But reliability has its limits too. In the broken clock case, your method, checking a wall clock, usually works. But in that one instance, it failed you. The belief was true, but the process didn't connect to the truth the way you thought it did. So even adding reliability doesn't fully solve the problem. Some people tried the idea of no defeaters. That means there's nothing else you should know that would cancel your justification. If you find out the clock is broken, that defeats your reason for believing it's 2. If there's no such fact to cancel your reason, then maybe it counts as knowledge. Still, there's debate. Every fix seems to work for some examples, but not all. Gettier cases are like small traps. They hide the flaw until you step into them. Then you see that your belief landed on the truth, but not in the right way. At the core of the problem is the role of luck. In each case, the person isn't wrong. They're not being careless. They have a belief that's both justified and true. But something about the way they hit the truth feels off. The connection between belief and truth is too thin. It's not strong enough to count as knowledge. Think of someone picking a number between 1 and 10. You guess 5. You're right. But you had no reason to think 5 was special. It just happened to be the correct number. That's not knowledge. That's guessing. The Gettier problem shows that sometimes, even when it looks like we're not guessing, we are. And the guess just happened to land. One way to explore the idea is through more careful examples. Suppose you walk into a room and see a man sitting in a chair. You believe there's a man in the room. That's true. The man is real. You're seeing him. But now add a twist. The man you're seeing is a realistic wax figure. The real man is behind a curtain. You're right. There is a man in the room, but your belief was based on a false impression. That makes it another Gettier case. This shows how fragile our reasons can be. The surface can look solid, but the foundation might not connect to the truth. That's what Gettier exposed. Not that we never know anything, but that the link between belief, justification, and truth is more complicated than it seemed. Philosophers still debate how to fix the problem. Some say we should raise the bar. Make knowledge require something like safe belief, meaning if you had believed otherwise, it would have been false. Others say knowledge needs to come from ability, that you hit the truth because you're good at getting to the truth, not by chance. There's also the view that maybe we should live with a little luck, that not all knowledge has to be perfect, that sometimes people know things even if they didn't get there in a straight line. But then we risk calling guesses and accidents knowledge, and that's where it starts to break down. The Gettier problem didn't destroy the idea of knowledge. It just made it clear that our old definition wasn't enough. It opened a space in the middle, between belief and truth, where things can go wrong in ways that are hard to spot. That space is where much of modern epistemology now lives. A man stands at a crosswalk. The light turns green, but he doesn't move. He's thinking about whether crossing the street now is the right thing to do. It's late at night. No cars are coming. He won't hurt anyone. Still, he feels unsure. He wonders what a completely fair and moral person would do in this situation. Not just any person, but one who knows all the facts, thinks clearly, and stays calm. This is the starting point of the ideal observer theory. The theory says moral truths come from what a perfectly informed, perfectly rational, and impartial observer would approve or disapprove of. This observer doesn't have personal bias. They don't get angry, tired, or scared. They know every relevant fact. They don't take sides. They see things clearly and react with full understanding. In this view, something is morally right if this kind of observer would approve of it. Something is wrong if the observer would disapprove. The idea doesn't rely on God or a specific culture. It doesn't depend on feelings that come and go. It asks us to imagine what someone completely fair and informed would say. This makes it a kind of moral objectivism. The theory claims there are right and wrong answers in ethics, even if people disagree. But those answers don't come from intuition or tradition. They come from what an ideal observer would decide. Take a teenager who finds a wallet full of cash on a park bench. He looks around. No one's nearby. He thinks about keeping the money. He also thinks about turning it in. He asks himself, what should I do? If he tries to apply the ideal observer theory, he won't just ask what his friends would do. He won't ask what feels good in the moment. Instead, he'll try to imagine what someone completely fair would say. Someone who knows who lost the wallet, how much the money means to them, and what kind of person the teenager wants to be. If the ideal observer would approve of turning the wallet in, then that's the right thing to do. This theory traces back to thinkers like Roderick Firth, who wrote about it in the 20th century. Firth tried to define the qualities of an ideal observer. They include omniscience about non-moral facts, logical consistency, emotional detachment, and impartiality. That's a tall order. No real person can meet those standards. But the point isn't to become such a person. The point is to use the idea as a guide. It's like asking, what would someone perfectly fair think of this? The answer can help shape our choices. Critics often say this makes morality too abstract. They ask how we can know what an ideal observer would think. After all, we're not ideal. We make mistakes, we forget things, we care more about people we know than strangers. That's true, but the theory doesn't require us to know the exact answer. It only asks us to aim in the right direction. When we face hard decisions, we can still try to be more informed, more fair, and more calm. We can ask better questions. We can seek facts. We can look at things from another point of view. Think of a judge in a court. The judge listens to both sides. She reads the law. She tries not to let her personal feelings get in the way. She might still be wrong, but the process matters. It's the same with the ideal observer theory. It gives a target. We won't hit the center every time, but we can aim for it. Another way to understand the theory is to compare it to other moral views. Some people say right and wrong come from emotions. If something feels bad, it's wrong. If it feels good, it's right. That's called subjectivism. But emotions change. One day something feels wrong, the next day it doesn't. The ideal observer theory avoids this problem by grounding morality in a stable, ideal perspective. Others say morality comes from what a culture believes. If a society agrees something is right, then it's right for that society. That's cultural relativism. But this view struggles with cases where a culture approves of things like slavery or discrimination. The ideal observer theory doesn't depend on what most people believe. It depends on what the ideal observer would approve of, even if no one else agrees. Picture a doctor faced with a tough choice. She has one dose of a rare drug and 2 patients who need it. One patient has a better chance of recovery. The other has no family and no support. She wants to be fair, but every option feels wrong. Here, the theory helps her step back. It doesn't give her a simple answer, but it asks her to consider what someone who knows all the facts, feels no bias, and thinks clearly would decide. That perspective can bring clarity when emotions or pressure cloud judgment. It's important to note that the ideal observer is not cold or cruel. They're emotionally detached, but not unfeeling. They understand suffering. They care about fairness. They just don't let their personal preferences guide their views. That's why their approval or disapproval has moral weight. They're not reacting out of habit or anger. They're reacting out of full understanding. Now think about someone deciding whether to lie. It's a small lie, something about being late to work. It would save them trouble. The boss won't check, no one gets hurt. But they still feel uneasy. If they ask what an ideal observer would think, the answer might not be about the small outcome. It might be about the habit of lying, or the kind of workplace trust that starts to break when honesty slips. The observer sees the bigger picture. Their disapproval isn't just about one lie. It's about the kind of world that grows out of it. The theory also helps explain why some moral rules feel more solid than others. Don't steal. Don't kill. Tell the truth. These rules tend to hold up under ideal scrutiny. They survive even when emotions and customs shift. That doesn't make them unchangeable, but it gives them a stronger foundation than rules based on tradition alone. Of course, people still ask whether the theory sneaks in personal bias by the back door. After all, who decides what the ideal observer looks like? If someone says the observer always agrees with their own moral views, then the theory loses its power. To avoid that, the qualities of the observer have to stay fixed: informed, impartial, calm, consistent. Those qualities keep the observer from just being a projection of our own opinions. Someone might also ask what happens if 2 ideal observers disagree. In theory, they shouldn't. If both are fully informed and rational and both see the same facts, they should reach the same judgment. That's part of what makes the theory objective. It claims that moral truths don't depend on the speaker. They depend on the quality of the judgment. But real life isn't that clean. People still argue about tough cases. They still bring different facts, different values, different perspectives. The ideal observer theory doesn't remove that. It just gives a way to sort through it. It gives a clear model to compare against. At its core, the theory tries to take moral thinking seriously. It doesn't treat ethics as personal taste or social fashion. It treats moral judgment as something that can be right or wrong, better or worse, depending on how it's made. Not perfect, not simple, but worth the effort. You look at a ripe tomato and say it's red. Someone else looks at the same tomato and also says it's red. You both agree and no one argues. But what if the color you see and the color they see are not the same? What if your red is their green, but you've both learned to call it red because that's what people around you said growing up? This is the idea behind the inverted spectrum. It's a thought experiment used in philosophy to explore how we talk about experience, especially things we can't measure or compare directly. Color is just one example. It works because we can't step into someone else's head. We can't see the world through their eyes, literally or otherwise. Say you grow up seeing a certain color and hearing people call it blue. Every time you see the sky, they say the sky is blue. You learn the word. You use it like everyone else. But what you see might be what someone else would call yellow if they could see it the way you do. And it doesn't stop there. Maybe every color is flipped. Your red is their green, your blue is their orange. But you all agree on the labels because the training happened the same way. The hard part is that there's no way to check. You can't pull your experience out and compare it to someone else's. You can't swap eyes or brains. You both pass the color blindness test. You both stop at red lights and go at green ones. You sort socks, pick apples, and design websites. Your behavior lines up, the language fits. But your actual experience, your qualia, as philosophers sometimes call it, might be different. This doesn't seem to cause problems. In daily life, the labels do the job. If you tell someone to hand you the red folder, they hand it to you. The coordination works. The system holds up. That's one reason people wonder if the difference matters. If the labels and behavior match, is there really a difference? Some argue there's no real issue. They say what matters is function. As long as the input leads to the right output, the inner part doesn't need to match. This view, often linked to functionalism in philosophy of mind, says mental states are defined by what they do, not by what they feel like. If your color experience leads you to say red at the right time and act accordingly, then that's enough. Others aren't so sure. They point out that experience feels like something. There's a what it's like aspect that doesn't show up in behavior. You could build a robot that sorts fruit and says the right color names, but we don't think the robot sees red. It's not having the experience. So maybe function isn't the full story. Inverted spectrum gets more complicated when you think about language. When you learn to speak, you don't get to choose your words. You're trained into them. A parent points at a ball and says, red. You don't know what they see, and they don't know what you see. But the word sticks. Over time, it becomes part of your world. You learn to match the sound to a certain part of your visual field. That's why it's hard to notice if something's off. Suppose your color experience shifts slowly over time. You wouldn't notice. You'd keep using the same words. You'd still say green when looking at grass, even if it started to look more like what others would call purple. The feedback loop holds the system in place. You adjust without knowing. This kind of mismatch isn't limited to color. You can apply the same idea to other senses. Take taste. Maybe your sweet is someone else's sour, but you both grew up calling chocolate sweet and lemon sour, so the words match the objects even if the feelings differ. The system teaches you how to speak, not how to compare raw experience. Or take pain. Maybe your pain feels sharp and tight while someone else's pain feels dull and heavy. You both say it hurts and you both go to the doctor. But inside, the experiences could be very different. No test will reveal that. You're trained to report pain in certain ways. You rate it on a scale, describe it in words, and move on. This gap between private experience and public language has been around a long time. Philosophers use cases like the inverted spectrum to test the limits of what we can know. They ask, if we can't detect a difference, does it matter? Some say yes. They think these gaps show that consciousness is more than behavior or function. Others say no. They think if it makes no difference in the world, then it's not a real problem. In the background, this connects to bigger questions. What is consciousness? Is it physical? Can it be measured? If two systems behave the same, do they have the same mind? Can we ever know what it's like to be someone else? These questions don't have clear answers, but the inverted spectrum keeps them alive. It reminds us that not everything we care about is easy to pin down. Now think about machines. Suppose you build an AI that mimics human behavior. It passes every test. It responds to color terms correctly. It says it likes red roses and blue skies. You ask it how it feels about a sunset, and it gives a thoughtful reply. Does it see color, or is it just using patterns? Does it have an inverted spectrum, or no spectrum at all? This leads back to the core problem. You can't get inside another mind. Whether it's a person or a machine, you can only watch behavior. You listen, observe, compare, you guess. But the inner part stays hidden. You trust the surface because that's all you get. The inverted spectrum plays with that trust. It shows how things could be different underneath, even if everything looks normal on top. You might try to build a test, something that could detect a flip in color experience. Maybe you'd measure brain activity or track subtle reaction times. But so far, nothing works. If there's a difference, it hides well. That's why the inverted spectrum stays theoretical. It's not about facts, it's about possibilities. This idea fits with others in the same area. Mary's room is one. She knows everything about color from books and lectures, but has never seen it. The day she sees red for the first time, does she learn something new? Or the philosophical zombie, someone who acts just like a person but has no inner life. These stories poke at the same mystery. They ask whether experience can be explained or whether something always slips past. Some people feel uneasy about this. They want things to line up. They want red to mean red. But others accept the ambiguity. They say it's enough that we've built a working system. The words match the world well enough for action. If deeper differences exist, they're out of reach. Either way, the inverted spectrum shows how much we take for granted. When we talk about color or taste or pain, we assume a shared world. We rely on common training, shared labels, and predictable responses. But behind the curtain, things might not be as they seem. And even if nothing changes, knowing that helps us see language and each other a bit more clearly. Some people have asked whether life is a dream. They mean it seriously, not as a joke or a poetic idea. They wonder whether the world around them is real or just something they're experiencing in their mind. The question sounds simple, but once you start looking at it, it opens up more questions than answers. When you dream at night, things seem real until you wake up. You talk to people, walk through rooms, get scared, feel joy, and none of it feels fake in the moment. You only realize it was a dream after you wake up. That's part of the problem. If a dream can feel that real, what if life right now is the same thing? What if you haven't woken up yet? This question goes back a long way. Philosophers in ancient India, China, and Greece raised it in different forms. In one well-known story, Zhuangzi, a Chinese philosopher, dreamed he was a butterfly. When he woke up, he wasn't sure if he was a man who had dreamed of being a butterfly, or a butterfly now dreaming of being a man. That wasn't just a puzzle. It pointed at something deeper about how we understand identity and what counts as real. People sometimes ask, how can I know I'm not dreaming right now? The truth is, in the middle of a dream, you usually don't know. You take everything at face value. You assume the world around you is stable and solid. You accept the people in front of you as real. Even strange things like floating in the air or speaking to someone who died can seem normal while you're dreaming. The feeling of reality doesn't go away until the dream ends. But during waking life, things feel more stable. You wake up in the same bed. You go to the same job. People remember what you said yesterday. In dreams, that kind of consistency doesn't always happen. You might be in a different city without explanation. You might speak a language you've never studied. The laws of physics might not apply. Still, those differences don't fully answer the question. Just because waking life feels more stable doesn't prove it isn't a dream. It could be a longer, more detailed one. Maybe the rules are just stricter. Maybe this dream plays by different logic. One response is to say that dreaming and waking life feel different, and that's how we tell them apart. That helps in practice, but it doesn't explain everything. Some dreams feel exactly like real life. In lucid dreaming, people can become aware they're dreaming and even control the dream. But that awareness doesn't always come. You might live out a whole story before you realize none of it happened. Now, suppose you wake up tomorrow and realize everything you've ever experienced was a dream. That your job, your home, your friends, none of it was real. Would that mean your life didn't matter? That depends on what you think real means. If it means something you can touch, measure, and return to, then dreams don't count. But if it means something that shapes you, moves you, or teaches you something, then dreams might still matter. Think about a dream where you lose someone. You might feel deep sorrow. You might cry. That feeling lingers even after you wake up. It shapes your mood, your thoughts, your day. The person wasn't real in the dream, but the grief was. So maybe the dream had real effects, even if the story behind it was false. This brings up another question. What if waking life is like that? Even if it turns out to be a dream, maybe it still matters. Maybe what counts is not whether something is real in a physical sense, but whether it has real effects on you, whether it leads you to act, to think, to change. There's also a technical side to this question. In philosophy, there's a thought experiment from René Descartes. He said that for all he knows, some powerful force could be tricking him, feeding him false images, making him believe in a world that isn't there. He couldn't prove the world existed, but he could prove he was thinking. So he said, "I think, therefore I am." He used that as his base, his anchor. But the question remains, if thinking proves your existence, it still doesn't prove the rest of the world is real. It just means someone is having thoughts, that someone could be a brain in a jar connected to wires, or a figure inside a dream thinking it's a real person. You can't rule that out with certainty. You can only make working assumptions. We do this all the time. We assume things are real because it helps us live. We trust our senses, not because they're perfect, but because they usually give us enough to get by. If the stove is hot, we learn not to touch it again. If someone smiles at us, we assume they're friendly. These patterns build up over time. They give us a kind of map. That map might not be perfect, but it helps us move through the world. People sometimes ask what the point is, if life might be a dream. The point isn't to stop living or to treat life as fake. It's to ask what really matters to us. If you care about someone, does it matter whether they're part of a dream? If you feel joy or sorrow, does it matter whether the world around you is made of atoms or images? In video games, people play for hours. They care about what happens. They try hard. They form goals. They talk about the game as if it's important. No one says the game is fake, even though it's not the real world. The game matters in its own way. Maybe life is like that. Maybe it matters not because it's objectively real, but because we live inside it. We feel things. We make choices. There's also the fact that we share this world. Even if it's a dream, it's one where we seem to meet other people, have conversations, and build relationships. We don't act like we're alone in it. We argue, agree, help, hurt, and care. That shared life feels real. It gives us meaning. If it turns out to be a dream, it's a shared one. Science doesn't have a clear answer either. It shows us how the brain builds reality, how light hits the eye, how signals go to the brain, how we form images, sounds, and thoughts. But it doesn't tell us why there's something rather than nothing. It can't explain consciousness, not fully. It describes the processes, but not the experience itself. That leaves space for doubt. So we keep asking, not because we expect an answer, but because the question shapes how we think. It reminds us not to take things for granted. It helps us stay aware that what we call reality might be more fragile than we think. It might rest on patterns, habits, and shared trust. It might not be solid in the way we assume, but it's still the place where we live, whether or not it's a dream. Jonathon Keats calls himself an experimental philosopher. That phrase sounds unusual, but it fits what he does. He takes big questions about time, value, knowledge, even the nature of the universe, and turns them into physical experiments. He doesn't do this with lab coats or test tubes. He uses everyday materials, odd setups, and public displays. His work doesn't try to prove anything. It tries to ask better questions. In one project, he sold real estate in the universe. He offered plots of space beyond Earth to buyers on Earth. The idea wasn't to make money. He priced the properties at a few dollars. The point was to show how strange it is to think of space, empty, unreachable, as something you can own. That idea reflects how we treat land on Earth. Ownership, borders, deeds, all these things are legal and cultural constructs. They aren't tied to the land itself. Selling the universe pointed out the absurdity. It made people stop and think. If I can own part of the cosmos, what does that mean about property on Earth? In another project, he built a camera designed to take a single photo over 1,000 years. He called it a Millennium Camera. He installed it in Arizona and pointed it at a landscape. The camera doesn't use digital sensors. It uses a pinhole and a fading pigment. As light hits the pigment, it slowly changes color. Over a century, then another, the image will build up. If it works, someone will see that picture in the year 3015. More likely, they'll see the remains of the camera, maybe damaged, maybe gone. But the point is not the picture. The point is to think in longer terms. We usually think about the next hour, maybe the next year. This camera invites us to think across centuries. He also tried to create a diet for plants based on philosophical schools of thought. That may sound like a joke, but it's not. He set up plants in a gallery and fed them ideas through light, which they need for photosynthesis. He projected the writings of Nietzsche or Confucius onto the leaves. The idea was to ask, what would it mean for a plant to grow on ideas instead of nutrients? Of course, it's not practical. But again, that's not the goal. The goal is to stretch how we think about nourishment, both for plants and for ourselves. Keats doesn't work in one field. He moves between art, science, and philosophy. He doesn't seem concerned with where one ends and another begins. For him, the labels don't matter. What matters is the question. What if we thought differently? What if we tried to test an idea, not with numbers, but with experiences? In one sense, he's a provocateur. In another, he's just someone trying to think out loud, using real-world objects. Take his attempt to create a god for plants. He set up a shrine in a public space and dedicated it to photosynthesis. For a plant, the sun is the source of life. Without light, it can't survive. So he reasoned, what if the sun is God from a plant's point of view? He wasn't mocking religion. He was asking people to shift their perspective. What does reverence look like from the view of a blade of grass? Another time, he created a currency based on time. Not time as money, but time as time. He stamped coins with units of time rather than value, like 5 minutes, 1 hour, half a day. The idea was simple: trade time, not money. You give someone an hour of your time. They give you back 2 30-minute coins. It doesn't require a bank. It doesn't rely on national economies. It asks what value means when you strip away markets. Can time be a fair currency? What happens if you pay a friend to help you move using hours instead of dollars? Does the exchange feel different? He once made a library for non-human species. It wasn't filled with books. It was built with scents, sounds, and materials other species could engage with. A deer doesn't read. A squirrel doesn't use a card catalog, but they do sense the world. They do have patterns. So he tried to make a space that they might read in their own way. This was not about communication. It was about making room for other ways of knowing. We often assume our way of thinking is the only one. A library for animals says, maybe there's more. He also tried to slow down time using art. In one gallery, he placed objects that changed very slowly. Some changed color over weeks. Some shifted shape with heat or cold. The goal was to pull visitors out of fast thinking. In most museums, people glance for a few seconds, then move on. His gallery tried to fight that. It asked, what if you had to wait for the art to happen? What if looking meant staying, not scanning? One of his better-known ideas was a telescope for the dead. He proposed building a device that would collect light from stars that went supernova long ago. The light would carry information from the past. He suggested that, in a poetic way, we could see the dead through this light. It's not science fiction, it's just physics. Light takes time to travel. When we look at stars, we see them as they were, not as they are. He took that idea and gave it weight, not as data, but as reflection. If we can see ancient stars, can we see ancient lives? Keats often works in public. He puts his projects in storefronts, parks, libraries. He doesn't aim for galleries or elite spaces. He wants people to stumble across his work. He wants the audience to ask, is this serious? Is this real? And once they ask that, they've already entered the experiment. He's not a prankster. He's not a trickster. He's deliberate. The ideas may look strange, but they're not careless. Each one pulls at something we take for granted. Ownership, time, knowledge. He doesn't answer questions. He doesn't claim to know more than anyone else. He just asks, what if we turned this idea inside out? He once suggested building a think tank for trees, not to study trees, but to include them, to let them, in some way, contribute. Of course, trees don't speak, but they do respond to weather, soil, water. He imagined a building where sensors picked up those responses and translated them into patterns, not words, patterns. Those patterns could then shape human decisions. Maybe not policy, maybe just attention. His work doesn't fit clean categories. It doesn't settle in one place. It keeps moving. Like someone trying to find the right angle on a thought. He doesn't explain everything. He lets the questions hang. That may frustrate some people, but it's also part of the point. If you feel unsettled, you might start thinking for yourself. He sees philosophy not as a subject, but as a tool. Not something to study, but something to use. His experiments aren't answers. They're ways to ask. And he believes the asking itself can be enough. Rudolf Lingens wakes up in a library. He doesn't know who he is. He remembers facts. He knows German. He knows what a library is. He knows the names of cities, dates in history, and how to read. He knows that water boils at 100 degrees Celsius. He knows how to walk and how to speak. He knows that someone named Rudolf Lingens exists and that Rudolf Lingens is from Vienna, studied literature, and wears brown shoes. But he doesn't know that he himself is Rudolf Lingens. This case was first described by philosopher John Perry. It's meant to show the difference between knowing facts and knowing something about yourself. Perry used Lingens to explain why some truths are not captured by knowledge of facts alone. Lingens has all the factual knowledge available. He has access to his own biography, but he's missing a piece. He doesn't know, I am Rudolf Lingens. There's something special about first-person knowledge. It's not about adding more data, it's about perspective. Lingens has all the third-person facts, but those facts don't help him locate himself in the world. He can read about someone named Lingens and even agree that this person's traits match his own. He might say, this man fits everything about me. Still, he doesn't make the leap. This man is me. This isn't a strange or made-up problem. It shows up in real life in simpler ways. You stand in a crowd, hear someone say, your shoe is untied, and look around. You don't think, oh, someone's shoe is untied. You check yourself first. That's the power of indexicals. Words like I, here, and now. They don't work like normal nouns. They don't refer to things you can point to in a list. They depend on who says them and when. Suppose someone finds a journal on a park bench. It's filled with facts. I live on Elm Street. I have a sister named Lena. I just lost my job. The reader might come to know a lot about the person who wrote it, but unless they know who wrote it, the meaning stays loose. The sentence, I lost my job, means something specific only when the speaker is known. Without that, it's floating. True, perhaps, but detached. This is the core of Lingens' problem. He can't connect the indexical I to his own body. Even if he sees a mirror and thinks, that man looks like Lingens, he still hasn't linked the self he's experiencing to the facts he knows. It's not a lack of intelligence. It's not even a memory problem, strictly speaking. It's that self-knowledge doesn't come from just adding facts. It comes from a shift in perspective. Think of a person with amnesia who hears someone call out, Rudolf. They look around. The voice gets louder. It's directed at them. Slowly, they might come to think, maybe I'm Rudolf. But that realization is more than a guess. It changes everything. It's not a fact about the world. It's a fact that reorganizes all the other facts they hold. This distinction matters in philosophy of mind and language. When we say, I am tired, we don't mean the same thing as Rudolf Lingens is tired. Even if they refer to the same person, the force of the statement is different. One comes from inside, the other comes from outside. One is subjective, the other is objective, but both are true. The key is that not all truths are of the same kind. Now think of someone reading a map. The map shows every street, every landmark, every label. But without a "you are here" marker, the map is just a picture. It's detailed, but useless until you find your place on it. Once you do, everything else makes sense. Before that, all the knowledge in the world can't help you act. This is Lingens in the library. He has the full map. He just doesn't know where he is on it. As a result, he can't use the information the way someone with self-location can. He can't decide where to go, what to do, or even what to think. He's stuck. All the data is there, but it doesn't connect. Another way to see it is in computer systems. You might program a robot to know everything about its environment. It knows there's a table to the left, a wall to the right, a doorway ahead, but unless it knows where it is in the room, it can't act on that knowledge. It will crash into things. It will make mistakes. It lacks indexical awareness. That awareness doesn't come from more information, it comes from orientation. This is why Lingens matters. He shows that full factual knowledge can still leave out something important. That missing part isn't a special substance or secret ingredient. It's just a shift from third person to first person, from general to specific, from detached to embedded. Suppose someone tells you there's a person in the library who has forgotten who he is. That gives you a fact. Now suppose someone else tells you you are that person. That's a different kind of knowledge. It doesn't add new facts about the world. It gives you a position in the world. That's what Lingens lacks. That's what he needs. Language reflects this. We can translate the Eiffel Tower is in Paris into any language and the truth stays the same. But I am cold depends on who says it. Translate it without context and it floats. It needs a speaker. That's why philosophers say indexicals are essential for certain types of meaning. They aren't just words. They're anchoring points. Lingens challenges the idea that knowledge is only about gathering more facts. He shows that some kinds of understanding only come when you locate yourself. You might call this self-knowledge, but it's not deep or mysterious. It's ordinary. It happens every time you say, I forgot my keys, or I think I left the oven on. You're not stating facts about a person named John or Sarah. You're speaking from a position no one else can take. It's easy to miss this difference. Most of the time, we flip between perspectives without thinking. We say I and she and they without noticing the shift. But when something breaks, like in Lingens' case, it becomes clear. The gears stop turning. The machine stalls. The missing piece isn't a memory. It's the pointer that says, this is me. In daily life, this plays out in smaller ways. You hear your name called in a waiting room and stand up. You recognize yourself in a photo. You reply to a text that says, where are you? All of these acts depend on self-location. They depend on being able to connect general knowledge to a particular self. Without that, you can't function. Lingens also shows up in discussions about artificial intelligence. If a machine gathers facts but can't locate itself, is it really aware? Does it know anything in the first-person sense? Maybe it can say I and me, but if those words don't connect to a real point of view, they're just noise. They lack grounding. None of this means that self-awareness is magical. It just means it's necessary. We often treat knowledge as something you collect, but some knowledge is more like a lens. It changes how you see everything else. Lingens doesn't need more facts. He needs a lens that puts him in the picture. A man has been blind since birth. He knows a cube and a sphere by touch. His hands can tell the sharp corners of the cube and the smooth round surface of the sphere. Then one day, he gains the ability to see. He opens his eyes for the first time. He sees two shapes on a table, one cube, one sphere. The question is simple. Without touching them, can he tell which is which? This is Molyneux' problem. It was first posed in the 17th century. William Molyneux wrote it in a letter to the philosopher John Locke. The problem asks whether we can connect information from one sense to another without learning how. More specifically, if someone knows shapes by touch alone, can they recognize those same shapes by sight alone the moment vision becomes available? The answer isn't obvious. Touch and sight are separate senses. They take in different kinds of data. Touch works through pressure, motion, and temperature. Sight works through light, color, and contrast. If a person has never seen anything before, the visual world is new. There are no stored images, no experience with depth, shadows, or outlines. The cube might look like a box. The sphere might look like a circle. Without the weight or shape in the hand, these images could seem flat or strange. The question challenges how we think about knowledge and perception. Some people say the man would know right away. They believe the mind holds a common link between senses. Once he sees, he'll match the visual shape with the memory of the tactile one. Others say no, he won't recognize them. His visual experience is too new. He needs time to learn how sight works and how to match it with what he already knows by touch. This touches on the idea of sense correspondence. Do the senses speak a shared language, or do they each need training before they can work together? If the senses are linked naturally, the man should know the cube and sphere right away. But if they're not, he'll need to relearn what he thought he knew, only now through his eyes. Think of a blind person who learns to read Braille. Each dot pattern maps to a letter. Over time, the person learns words, sentences, and meaning. If that same person regains sight, will printed text make sense right away? Will the dots and lines of letters be readable without touch? Probably not. The new sense needs new training. The eye must learn to connect shapes to language, just as the hand did before. We often assume that knowledge is stored in a central way. We think of the mind as holding concepts that are separate from the senses. But this problem suggests otherwise. It suggests that our understanding is tied to the way we gather it. If we learn something through touch, that knowledge might not carry over into sight. The shape in the hand and the shape in the eye are not the same unless experience teaches us to link them. Now picture someone learning to drive. They know the rules of the road. They've watched people drive for years. But the first time they sit behind the wheel, all that knowledge doesn't help much. The feeling of the gas pedal, the force needed to turn the wheel, the timing of the brakes, these can't be known just by watching. The body has to learn them. The same could be true for the senses. Knowing a thing by touch might not mean knowing it by sight. Some modern cases have tested this problem. In rare cases, people born blind have gained sight through surgery. The results show that Molyneux' guess was probably right. The patients could not match the shapes right away. They could see the objects, and they still knew what a cube or a sphere felt like, but they didn't know which one they were looking at. Only after some time and practice, touching and looking at the same object, could they learn to match the two. This supports the idea that perception is learned, not just received. The senses must be trained. We don't see with our eyes alone, we see with our experience. The same goes for touch, sound, and taste. What we sense is shaped by what we've learned to expect. If you've never seen depth before, a 3D object may look flat. If you've never seen color before, it may not match anything you've felt. You need time to build up a new library of sense matching. Another example is sound. Think of someone learning a second language by ear. At first, all the sounds blur together. The words feel fast and without clear breaks. But after some practice, the ear starts to catch the patterns. The brain learns to link the sounds to meaning. Without that training, the sounds stay as noise. The same might be true for sight. Without prior visual experience, the shapes don't carry meaning. They're just light and lines until the brain learns to connect them. People who have grown up with sight don't notice how much they've learned. They take it for granted that sight gives meaning right away. But most of what they know about seeing has been built slowly. A baby sees shapes, movement, and light, but doesn't know what anything is. Over time, the baby learns to name what it sees, connect it with touch and sound, and understand what it means. The senses grow together through use. They are not born fused. If you hold a tennis ball in your hand with your eyes closed, you know its shape. But if you've never seen a sphere before, and you open your eyes for the first time, you wouldn't know that the round object in front of you is the same thing you're used to holding. Your visual system needs to match what it sees with what your hand remembers. That takes practice. You can also think of virtual reality. If you put on a headset and reach for a virtual object, your eyes tell you it's there, but your hands don't feel it. At first, the illusion is strange. It feels wrong. The senses don't match. But over time, people start to believe the object is there, even when they don't feel it. The brain learns to trust the new sense input. It adjusts expectations. This shows how the brain blends data from multiple senses, but only after it learns how. Molyneux' problem reminds us that knowing isn't always simple. The body plays a role. The senses matter. They don't just send data to the brain, they shape the way we build meaning. A blind man who gains sight doesn't just turn on a light switch. He has to rebuild his world. He has to learn again what he already knows. That takes time and practice and trial and error. We tend to think of learning as something the mind does on its own, but this problem shows that the body is involved at every step. What we know depends on how we sense it, and when one sense is added or changed, our way of knowing changes too. The man who sees for the first time steps into a new world. The cube and the sphere are still there, but they are not the same until he learns how to see them. You say something is true. Someone asks, "How do you know?" You give a reason. Then they ask, "How do you know that?" You give another reason. They ask again. At some point, you run out. You either say, "That's just the way it is," or you circle back to something you already said. Either way, the chain breaks. This is the problem of justification. It's not about facts, it's about how we support what we believe. We're used to thinking that knowledge rests on reasons. If someone says the sky is blue, we expect them to point to the sky or explain how light works. If someone says a law is fair, we expect them to give an argument. But every reason needs a reason. The process doesn't stop unless we decide to stop it. The Münchhausen trilemma gives a name to this problem. It says that any attempt to justify a belief ends in one of three ways. Either you keep giving reasons forever, which isn't possible, or you loop back to something you've already said, which is circular, or you stop at some point and say, "This doesn't need a reason," which makes it arbitrary. The name comes from a made-up story. Baron Münchhausen claimed he once pulled himself out of a swamp by grabbing his own hair. That's not possible. You can't lift yourself up without something outside yourself. The story is a joke. But the trilemma isn't. Take a simple example. You say water boils at 100 degrees Celsius. Someone asks why. You say that's what science says. They ask why science is trustworthy. You say it's based on evidence. They ask why evidence matters. You say because it reflects reality. They ask how you know that. The chain goes on. You might say at some point we have to agree on something, and that's true. But the trilemma says that whatever point you stop at, you've made a choice. Either you pick something you won't question, or you loop back, or you admit you can't give full support. This comes up in philosophy all the time. Someone says, "We know this because it's self-evident." But that's just a way of stopping the chain. Someone else says, "We know this because it fits our system." But that system is built on assumptions. Another person says, "We know this because it works." But works needs its own support. Every move leads back to the trilemma. In law, a judge might say, "The Constitution says this." A lawyer asks, "Why does that hold?" The judge says, "Because the system gives it authority." The lawyer says, "Why should we follow that system?" And so on. At some point, the law rests not on final proof, but on agreement. We treat the system as valid because we need a stopping point. But we could always ask again. In science, we say theories are based on data, but data needs interpretation. Interpretation uses models. Models rest on methods. Methods rely on assumptions about what counts as valid. These assumptions can be challenged. A scientist might say we use the scientific method, but the method itself can't be proven without using it. That's circular. Religious belief shows the same structure. Someone says this is true because it's in Scripture. You ask why Scripture should be trusted. They say it's the Word of God. You ask how they know that. They say it says so in the text. The chain loops, or it stops with faith. That's the third option. None of these are mistakes. They're just the only routes available. Education uses all three paths. A teacher says 2 + 2 is 4. A child asks why. The teacher gives examples. The child asks more questions. Eventually, the teacher says, "That's how numbers work." The justification ends. In math, we call that an axiom. It's a starting point we agree not to question, but we choose it. It doesn't prove itself. Even personal values fall into this pattern. You say, "I should help people." Someone asks why. You say, "Because it's right." They ask, "What makes it right?" You say, "Because it brings happiness." They ask why happiness matters. You say, "Because life is better that way." The questions could keep going. You either stop, loop, or go on forever. Some people treat this as a problem to solve. They try to build systems where everything supports everything else. That's coherence. But coherence still relies on initial choices. If your starting points shift, your whole system can fall apart. Others try to ground everything in experience, but experience can't be its own proof. It depends on how you interpret it. And some just accept the trilemma. They say we stop where we stop, and that's okay. But that's a choice too. You can see the trilemma in daily life. Someone says that's unfair. You ask why. They say because it treats people unequally. You ask why equality matters. They say because it's a basic right. You ask what makes it basic. They say we all just know. The conversation ends not because the question was answered, but because they reached the end of their chain. Think about how people argue online. One side gives a reason, the other challenges it. Then they challenge the next reason, and the next. Eventually, someone says, "You just don't get it," or "That's obvious." That's the third path, stopping at a point beyond which they won't go. Not because it's been proven, but because they've chosen to stop. In debates, circular reasoning gets exposed often. Someone says, "This news source is reliable." You ask why. They say, "Because it tells the truth." You ask how they know it tells the truth. They say, "Because it's reliable." The circle tightens. It sounds persuasive until someone points it out. Or look at tradition. People say, "We've always done it this way." You ask why that matters. They say, "Because it works." You ask why working matters more than doing what's right. They say, "Because doing what works is right." The reasoning loops, or it ends in a claim that doesn't need support. That's the trilemma again. The Münchhausen trilemma isn't a failure in logic. It's a description of how justification works. Every system, belief, or argument hits the same wall. You can build a strong case, you can provide reasons, but you can't give a reason for everything. Not all the way down. Something has to give. Most of the time we don't notice. We stop where it feels natural. We agree to stop together. That's what makes conversation possible. If we demanded full justification every time, we'd never get past the first sentence. But when we want to push deeper, when we want to know why something really matters, the trilemma is always waiting. It's not a trap, it's a reminder. Reasons don't go on forever. At some point, belief begins not with proof, but with trust, habit, or a choice to stop asking. That's not a flaw in thinking, it's just how it works. Some physicists say there may be many universes, not just one. They call this the multiverse. But the idea of n universes doesn't come from science, at least not in this case. It comes from thought experiments used in philosophy and logic. The n just means any number, like in algebra. It could be 2. It could be 1,000,000. The point is that more than one universe might exist, and each one could work under its own set of rules. This isn't about science fiction. It's about how we think through problems. When people use the term n universes, they often mean a range of possible worlds. Each world follows its own logic. Each one has its own facts. The phrase helps make hard questions easier to manage by separating them into simpler models. You can test a belief or idea by asking whether it holds up across many versions of the world. Start with a simple example. Suppose a person says, "Lying is always wrong." To test that, you can think of different universes. In universe A, someone lies to save a life. In universe B, someone lies for money. In universe C, someone lies to protect a friend from harm. In each case, the lie is still a lie. But does the rule "lying is always wrong" still apply? Some people might say yes, others might change their minds after thinking through the examples. The idea of n universes helps sort that out. Each universe isn't real in the physical sense. You can't visit them, but you can use them to push your own thinking. You imagine how things could be, not just how they are. You ask what would happen if some fact were different, if gravity worked the other way, if people had no memory, if time ran backward. These are strange ideas, but they help clarify what we believe and why we believe it. One use of n universes shows up in ethics. Philosophers often ask, what should someone do in a certain case? Instead of giving one answer, they test the rule in several possible worlds. This doesn't mean they're avoiding the question. They're trying to see if the rule makes sense beyond one setting. A rule that only works in one world might not be a good rule. If it works across many, it may hold more weight. Here's another case. Someone believes that freedom is the most important value. That sounds simple, but then you build possible universes to test it. In universe A, everyone is free but lives in poverty. In universe B, people give up some freedom for basic security and comfort. In universe C, no one has freedom, but no one suffers. Which universe seems better? That depends on how much value you place on freedom versus other goods. Using n-universes doesn't tell you what to believe. It gives you room to explore what your beliefs imply. Logic uses a similar move. When someone makes a claim, you can check it for truth by seeing if it holds in all cases. You don't need real examples. You test the structure. Think about this claim. If it rains, the streets get wet. That holds in universe A, where rain falls as usual. But what about universe B, where the streets are covered by a dome? There, rain doesn't touch the streets. So the claim fails in that world. This doesn't make the claim false in the real world, but it shows its limits. N-universes help show how far a claim can stretch before it breaks. The same idea appears in programming. Coders write functions and test them with inputs. Each input can be seen as a mini-universe. You check how the function behaves. Does it return the right value? Does it break under some condition? Programmers often write test cases. They think of edge cases where the function might fail. That's not so different from how n-universes work in logic or ethics. You look for edge cases. You try to break your own idea. If it holds up, you trust it more. In law, n-universe thinking can be useful too. Say a law says people under 18 can't vote. That's a rule. Now test it in different cases. In universe A, a 17-year-old with a PhD can't vote. In universe B, an 18-year-old with no education can. The rule stays the same. But how does that feel in terms of fairness? That leads to questions about what the rule aims to protect. N-universes don't give you answers. They show you what's at stake when a rule gets applied in different ways. Thought experiments often depend on this approach. The trolley problem, a famous ethics case, does it clearly. You're asked if you'd pull a lever to save 5 lives at the cost of 1. Then the details change. The person is your friend. The 5 are strangers. The 1 is a child. The 5 are criminals. Each version is its own universe. The problem isn't about the train. It's about moral trade-offs. N-universes make those trade-offs easier to see, even if they're hard to solve. Even in daily life, people use versions of this. A manager thinks, if I fire this person, what will happen? That leads to scenarios. Maybe morale drops. Maybe work improves. Maybe someone else quits. The manager is building n-universes in their head, each one with its own result. They aren't doing philosophy, but they're using the same structure. They're modeling outcomes to make better choices. In games, the idea shows up again. A game designer creates rules, then they test them. What if the player takes this path? What if they find a hidden item too early? What if 2 rules clash? Each case is a small universe. The game must hold up under all of them. If not, it breaks or becomes unfair. That's why good design includes testing across cases. It's not enough for the rules to work once. They must work always, under pressure, in strange corners. People sometimes worry that this kind of thinking is too abstract, but it's not about avoiding reality. It's about making sense of it. The real world is messy. You can't test every decision in advance, but you can model versions of it, one change at a time. You don't need a lab. You just need to ask, what if, and follow the answer where it leads. That's what n-universes offer, a controlled way to explore chaos, a method for seeing the shape of a rule, belief, or decision when it meets the world from more than one side. They don't require belief in other dimensions or alternate timelines. They only ask that you hold more than one version of a thing in your mind long enough to see what it's really made of. Suppose you had to design a society from scratch. You don't know what your job will be. You don't know your gender, race, religion, or talents. You don't even know what your values will be. You just know that once the society is built, you'll have to live in it, no matter who you turn out to be. That's the idea behind the original position. John Rawls, a political philosopher, came up with this thought experiment. He used it to explain what justice looks like when people decide rules fairly. The original position is not a place, and it's not a real meeting. It's a way to think clearly about fairness. When you stand in the original position, you imagine choosing rules for a society while wearing what Rawls called the veil of ignorance. The veil of ignorance hides your personal facts. Behind it, you don't know if you'll be rich or poor, strong or weak, healthy or sick. You don't know if you'll be part of the majority or a minority. You don't know if you'll live in a city or in the countryside. Without that knowledge, you can't make rules that favor your own group. You don't know what group you'll be in. Think of it like a game. You're helping write the rules, but you don't know which player you'll be. You wouldn't write rules that give all the points to the first player if you might turn out to be the last. You'd want the rules to be fair to everyone. You'd want a level field because you could end up anywhere. Rawls thought this setup would lead people to agree on two main principles. First, everyone should have the same basic liberties: freedom of speech, freedom of religion, the right to vote, and so on. These rights would apply to all and couldn't be traded for anything else. You wouldn't risk losing those freedoms just to gain a better spot in society because you might be the one left out. Second, social and economic inequalities are only fair if they help the least well off. If someone earns more or holds more power, it must be because that role helps others, especially those with the least. This is called the difference principle. It doesn't mean everyone gets the same amount. It means any extra must work to improve the situation of those at the bottom. Take doctors, for example. Society pays them well. That's fine, Rawls would say, as long as their higher income helps those who need care. If their work benefits others in real ways, curing illness, saving lives, then the inequality in pay is justified. But if someone earns more and the system leaves others worse off, then the rule fails the test of fairness. The veil of ignorance makes this clear. Behind it, you wouldn't bet on being rich or talented. You'd be cautious. You'd want a system where, even if you ended up at the bottom, your life would still be decent. You'd want a safety net. You'd want public education, healthcare, and protection under the law. You'd avoid a system where a few people win big and many suffer because you might not be one of the winners. This doesn't mean people wouldn't take risks or strive for success. The original position doesn't stop ambition. It just sets limits on what kinds of inequality are fair. It protects the basic structure of society so that no one ends up trapped at the bottom with no chance to improve. Think about building a bridge. If you don't know which car you'll be in, big or small, fast or slow, you'll build the bridge to hold all kinds. You won't take chances. You'll design for safety. That's how Rawls saw justice. When you design rules without knowing your own place, you design for fairness. The original position also helps with hard questions. Suppose you're deciding how to fund schools. One plan sends more money to wealthy neighborhoods because they already have more resources. Another plan sends more to poor areas to balance the gap. Behind the veil, you don't know where you'll live. You might end up in a poor district. That makes it more likely you'll choose the second plan. Not out of charity, but out of reason. It protects you in case you end up with less. Or think about healthcare. Behind the veil, you don't know if you'll be healthy. You might be born with a condition. You might face high medical bills. In that case, you'd want a system that guarantees care for everyone. You wouldn't want to gamble on a private system that only helps the lucky. You'd build in access. You'd think long-term. Rawls didn't say everyone would agree on every detail. The original position sets a frame, not a blueprint. It gives a way to check whether rules are fair. If you wouldn't accept a rule knowing you might be the worst off person in society, then the rule probably isn't just. Some critics say the original position asks too much. They say people can't really set aside their interests. Rawls wasn't asking people to forget who they are. He was asking them to imagine a position where personal bias doesn't count. It's a mental tool, like thinking through a math problem step by step, even when the answer feels obvious. Others say the original position is too ideal. Real politics involves power, compromise, and history. Rawls didn't deny that. He thought we need principles that help us judge when a law or policy is moving us closer to fairness. Without such principles, we get stuck defending the way things are just because they exist. Rawls's idea has been used in courts, classrooms, and policy debates. It offers a way to speak clearly about justice without relying on religion, ideology, or tradition. It doesn't assume people are good. It assumes people are rational and risk-averse. It uses that to ask what kind of society they'd build if they had no idea where they'd end up. A person behind the veil doesn't vote for their group. They vote for everyone. That's the power of the original position. It forces fairness by blocking bias. It removes the temptation to cheat for your side because you don't know what your side is. You only know that once the rules are set, you'll have to live under them. That makes your choices careful. It makes your rules stronger. Rawls believed this thought experiment brings clarity. It doesn't answer every question, but it does set a standard. If a rule seems fair in the original position, there's a good chance it's fair outside of it too. That's the test. That's the point. Someone sees an old photo of themselves from childhood. They stare at it for a minute. The clothes don't fit anymore. The haircut is different. The face has changed. But they say, "That's me." They don't mean it looks like them. They mean it is them, the same person, even after all this time. That raises a basic question. What makes someone the same person over time? People change, bodies grow, age, break, and heal. Thoughts shift, memories come and go, beliefs evolve. Someone can go from being quiet to being outspoken, or from angry to patient. But through it all, we still talk about them as one person. Not a new person each year or decade. One person, the same person. Some say memory holds identity together. You remember being 5. You remember being 15. These memories link the earlier self to the current one. But memory doesn't always work. You might forget large parts of your life. You might lose your memory in an accident. People with dementia may forget their name, their family, their past. Still, we call them the same person. Others turn to the body. You have the same body, or at least a continuous one. Even if it changes, it doesn't stop being yours. But that's not always enough. Someone can lose a limb, get an organ transplant, or go through major surgery. Their body changes in extreme ways. Still, we don't say they've become someone else. We say they're the same person in a changed body. Think about someone in a coma for years. They're alive but unconscious. When they wake up, they may not remember anything. They may not even feel like the same person, but their family, friends, and the law treat them as the same person. Their name doesn't change. Their debts, rights, and responsibilities stay in place. Something ties the earlier person to the current one, even without memory or awareness. Philosophers call this the problem of personal identity. What makes you you over time? What lets us say you're the same person yesterday, today, and tomorrow, even as almost everything about you changes? There's a thought experiment about a man named Theseus and his ship. Over time, every piece of wood on the ship gets replaced. First a plank, then a sail, then the mast. Eventually, no original part remains. But it happens slowly, piece by piece. At each stage, people still call it the ship of Theseus. They don't treat it as a new ship. They treat it as the same ship with new parts. Then someone asks, what if you kept all the old parts in storage and rebuilt the original ship? Which one is the real ship of Theseus? The one that got updated piece by piece, or the one made from the original parts? That example raises a problem with identity over time. If parts can change and we still keep the name, then maybe continuity matters more than specific parts. Something similar happens with people. Your body changes, your mind changes, but the change is usually slow and steady. You don't wake up with a different personality each morning. So the identity holds, even if all the parts shift. Now picture a more extreme case. A science fiction story describes a machine that scans a person, atom by atom, and builds a perfect copy somewhere else. The original person is destroyed in the process. The copy wakes up and says, "I'm here." Same memories, same body, same voice. Is that still the same person? Some would say yes. The pattern continues. The person acts, speaks, and remembers the same way. Others would say no. The original died, and the copy is only a replica, no matter how perfect. That shows how fragile our sense of identity can be. We rely on continuity, but we also have a gut feeling that breaking the link, especially through death, severs identity. Think about twins. They might look the same, sound the same, act the same, but we don't confuse them. We say they're two people, even if they share almost everything. Why? Because they have separate histories, different thoughts, different experiences. Their paths don't overlap completely. Even if they were cloned, raised in the same room, and dressed the same, we'd still say they're not the same person. That shows how personal identity involves more than appearance or behavior. It includes a kind of narrative. You remember your past, you expect a future. You tell a story about who you are, where you've been, and what matters to you. That story gives shape to your identity. It connects the pieces. People sometimes lose that thread. Trauma, illness, or radical life changes can make someone feel like a stranger to themselves. A soldier comes back from war and says, "I'm not who I used to be." A survivor of abuse says that person doesn't exist anymore. We still see them as the same individual, right? But they may feel cut off from their earlier self. That shows the tension between internal and external views. From the outside, identity can seem stable. From the inside, it can feel broken. Both views matter. We use them in different ways. The law tracks people through documents, records, and fingerprints. It needs a stable identity. A person can't escape debt or crime by claiming to be someone new. But in personal life, we allow more fluidity. We say people can grow, heal, change, or find themselves. Even in language, we use identity in flexible ways. We say he's not himself today, or she's changed a lot. These phrases admit that identity has layers. You can be the same person and still feel or act completely different. Identity doesn't mean being frozen in time. It means holding a thread that weaves through change. Religion, too, has its own answers. Some believe in a soul, a part of the self that stays constant through life and even after death. Others see identity as tied to roles or duties: parent, teacher, citizen. In those views, what matters isn't the body or the mind alone, but the position the person holds in a web of relationships. There are also practical stakes. Identity affects who we trust, who we blame, who we protect. If someone claims they're not the same person who made a promise, we don't usually accept that. We expect people to stay connected to their past actions. That expectation shapes how we live together. It creates accountability, loyalty, and forgiveness. Someone once asked, if a person wakes up with no memory and a completely different personality, but in the same body, are they still responsible for what they did before? That question doesn't have an easy answer. It forces us to decide what part of a person we care about most: the mind, the memory, the body, or the story. Personal identity isn't simple. It shifts, it stretches, but we treat it as stable enough to use in daily life. We use names, records, and habits to hold it in place. At the same time, we accept that people change. They lose parts of themselves and gain new ones. The thread remains, even if the cloth looks different. A man is building a wall. He calls out, "Brick!" and someone hands him a brick. Then he says, "Mortar," and gets mortar. There's no small talk, no confusion. Each word leads to an action. That's what Ludwig Wittgenstein starts with in Philosophical Investigations. He wants us to look at language not as a code for ideas, but as something people do, a form of life. Language for him doesn't just describe the world, it works in the world. It gets things done. The man at the wall isn't thinking about the meaning of brick. He's not translating from thought into speech. He's part of an activity where the word plays a role. You could say the word is like a tool. It does something when used in the right way, in the right setting. This is the core of Wittgenstein's idea of a language game. Not a game like chess with fixed rules and a winner, but a pattern of human activity where language plays a role. Different games have different rules. The word check means something in chess, something else in a bank, and something else again when looking a list. The meaning isn't in the word itself, it's in how the word fits into a practice. Think about how we teach words to children. A child points to a dog and says, "Dog." We nod and say, "Yes, that's a dog." Later, the child sees a cat and says, "Dog." We correct them. They learn, not by looking inside themselves, but by seeing what counts as right. The learning happens out in the open. It's social. It's practical. This goes against a certain picture of language. The old picture says that words name things. You have an idea in your head, you find a word for it, and you say it. The listener hears the word, unpacks it, and gets the idea. But this doesn't hold up. Not all words name things. What does if name? Or hello? Or ouch? And even when words do point to things, the connection isn't always clear. Game can mean football, solitaire, hide and seek, or playing with a toy. There's no single feature that covers them all. Wittgenstein uses the term family resemblance to describe how words like game work. Members of a family don't all look the same. One has the nose, another the eyes, another the walk, but you see the link. Language is like that. Words gather meaning from use, not from matching an inner picture. You understand what a word means by seeing how people use it, not by staring at your thoughts. Suppose someone says, "I know I'm in pain because I can feel it." That seems obvious. But what does it mean to say, "I know I'm in pain"? Is pain the kind of thing you know? Can someone be wrong about their own pain? These are the questions Wittgenstein asks, not to doubt pain exists, but to see how language works around it. Saying I'm in pain isn't the same as saying I know I'm in pain. The second version sounds strange because usually we don't say we know we're in pain. We just say it hurts. The point isn't to split hairs. It's to notice how much of our language depends on the setting. When we pull words out of their usual use and examine them in isolation, they start to confuse us. We treat them like objects rather than tools. Wittgenstein says the trouble begins when language goes on holiday, when we take words away from the work they do and treat them as pictures or signs without context. Let's say you try to define understanding. You might say it's a kind of mental state, but what if you teach someone to use a word correctly and they never explain what goes on in their head? Does that mean they don't understand? Or imagine someone says, I understand, but keeps misusing the word. Do they understand it or not? We judge by what people do, not by what they claim. This is where the idea of private language comes in. Wittgenstein argues that a language no one else can check or correct isn't really a language. Suppose you try to invent words for your own sensations. You write S in your notebook every time you feel a certain way, but what makes it the same feeling each time? You have no outside check. You rely only on memory, which can fail. And even if you were right, there would be no way to teach or correct it. The sign S would float without anchors. That doesn't mean we can't talk about private experiences. We do it all the time, but we do it using public language. You say, I feel sick, and others know what you mean. Not because they see your feeling, but because they've learned how those words work. They've been taught when to use them and how to respond. The words make sense because they're part of a shared practice. Think about how we use the word promise. It's not a description of a state, it's an act. When you say I promise, you do something. You commit. There's no need to feel a certain way. You might break the promise, but that doesn't mean it wasn't real. The force of the word lies in the situation and how others understand it. The same goes for words like belief, thought, hope, and intention. These aren't boxes we open to find facts, they're roles in our lives. We talk about belief to explain actions, to share outlooks, to guide decisions. We don't inspect the belief itself. We look at what people do, what they say, how they react. Wittgenstein says meaning is use. Not in a vague way, but in a grounded way. Words do things. They take part in activities. The question to ask isn't, what does this word mean deep down, but how is this word used? That shift clears up a lot of confusion. It stops us from chasing ghosts in our minds. Suppose someone says time is a river. That's poetic, but it's not a description of an object. It's a way of talking. It shapes how we see things. Wittgenstein might ask, in what context does that phrase come up? What does it lead to? He's not against metaphor, but he wants to make sure we don't mistake it for literal truth. Or take math. We say 2 + 2 = 4. That feels like a fact, but it's also a rule. It's part of a system we use. We learn it, drill it, apply it. It's not just true, it's part of how we train minds, organize systems, build machines. The truth lives in the practice. That's how philosophical investigations moves. Not by laying down theories, but by looking closely at how we talk. By holding up examples, not arguments. Wittgenstein doesn't say, here's what language is, he says, look at this. Then, now look at that. He gives you a path, not a conclusion. The point is to see clearly, to notice what's right in front of you. To stop thinking there must be something hidden behind how we speak. Because often, the surface is enough. Socrates meets a young man named Hippocrates, who wants to study with Protagoras. Hippocrates thinks this will make him wiser and more respected. He's excited but unsure what he'll actually learn. He doesn't know if Protagoras teaches something useful or just makes people sound clever. Socrates wants to understand this better, so he offers to go with him. They find Protagoras in a house crowded with students. Some are young men from Athens. Others have come from far away. They follow him around, listening to everything he says. He walks as he talks, and they keep pace. Socrates greets him and says they'd like to speak, if he's willing. Protagoras agrees and leads them to a quiet space. Socrates asks a direct question. What does Protagoras teach? If Hippocrates studies with him, what will he come away knowing? Protagoras answers without much hesitation. He says he teaches the art of being a good citizen, not reading or writing, not music or math. He teaches how to manage your own affairs, how to speak well in public, how to influence others. In short, he teaches virtue. Socrates pushes back. He wants to know if virtue can even be taught. People often say it can't. They believe it's something you either have or you don't. If someone's brave or just or wise, they think that comes from nature or luck, not teaching. Socrates says even the best citizens often can't pass on their excellence to their own sons. If that's true, how could Protagoras promise to teach it to strangers? Protagoras says people are wrong to think virtue can't be taught. He says the very way we raise children shows we believe it can. Parents send their children to school to learn discipline. They teach them what's right and wrong. They scold and praise. They make rules. Later, the city does the same. There are laws. There are courts. There's shame and honor. All of this shapes how people behave. If someone doesn't respond to these lessons, we say they're hopeless. That means we expect most people to learn. He gives an example. Imagine a boy who shows no interest in music. We don't get angry. We say music isn't for him. But if someone doesn't know justice or fairness, we don't say that. We don't let it go. We push them harder. That's because we believe these things can and must be taught. They're necessary for life together in the city. Socrates listens, but doesn't give in. He says there's still a problem. When we ask what virtue is, people don't give one answer. They name different things: justice, courage, wisdom, temperance. Are these parts of virtue like parts of a face, or are they names for the same thing? Can someone have one without the others? Can someone be just but not wise? Protagoras says they're all parts, but not equal. Courage is one part. Justice is another. They're different, like the parts of a face. Someone can be more courageous than wise, or more self-controlled than fair. Socrates disagrees. He says you can't really have one without the others. If someone acts justly, they must know what justice is. That takes wisdom. If someone knows what's good, they'll do it. That takes self-control. So in the end, all the parts of virtue are tied to knowledge. To test this, Socrates tells a story. He says people often think pleasure is bad and pain is good. But when you ask them, they admit they choose pleasure and avoid pain. So maybe what matters is knowing which pleasures are better or which pains are worth enduring. That would mean wisdom is about measuring, knowing how much good or harm something brings. In that case, being good is about having the right knowledge, not just strong will. Protagoras tries to answer, but the talk becomes long and tangled. They debate whether knowledge can rule a person, or if something else, like desire or fear, can overpower it. Socrates says people only act against knowledge if they lack it. If someone drinks poison thinking it's wine, they don't act against knowledge, they act in ignorance. If someone knows something will harm them but still chooses it, maybe they don't fully understand the harm. Maybe their knowledge isn't complete. This turns the talk toward the idea that all virtue is one thing: knowledge. If that's true, then teaching virtue makes sense, as long as knowledge can be taught. But this also means we need to understand what we're teaching, not just make people repeat slogans, not just give them rules. We have to help them see clearly, measure clearly, choose based on reason. Protagoras holds to his view. He believes experience and practice matter. He thinks wisdom grows from being around good people, hearing speeches, studying examples. He says the city teaches virtue all the time, through law, through tradition, through shared life. A teacher like him just speeds that up. He makes it more precise. Socrates remains unsure. He says he often doesn't know what virtue really is. He admits he keeps asking because he doesn't have a final answer. But he believes the question is worth asking, because without clear thinking, we risk saying we teach something we don't understand. We risk speaking in circles. Their talk doesn't end with a clear winner. It ends with agreement that the question is complex. Socrates says he's still not sure if virtue can be taught. He's not sure what virtue is. But he's sure it's better to examine these things than to pretend to know. The others in the room have listened the whole time. Some nod, some look puzzled, some seem tired, but none of them interrupt. The conversation wasn't short. It moved in loops and detours, but it kept to a purpose: to make clear what's often taken for granted, to check if what we say matches what we mean, and if it doesn't, to ask again. A field worker hears a word in a language they don't know. A person points to a rabbit and says, Gavagai. The field worker writes it down. She thinks it means rabbit, but that's just a guess. It might mean animal. It might mean white fur. It might mean food, danger, or there goes dinner. All she has is the sound and the context. She sees a rabbit, she hears the word, she makes a link. This is the start of radical translation. The idea comes from philosopher W.V.O. Queen. He wanted to show how hard it is to pin down meaning when translating from one language to another without any shared background. In radical translation, you try to understand a new language from scratch. No shared culture, no bilingual guide, just observation. You might think that if you watch closely, you'll figure things out. If someone shouts Gavagai every time a rabbit runs by, then it must mean rabbit. But how do you know they're not referring to part of the rabbit, or the rabbit's movement, or a specific kind of rabbit? Maybe they mean quick thing, or look out. The field worker can't get into the speaker's mind. She can only make guesses based on what she sees and hears. Even when the guesses seem to work, they rest on assumptions. She assumes the people around her divide the world up the same way she does. She assumes that they talk about objects and actions and feelings in ways that match her own language. But those are big assumptions. Queen argued that there's always more than one way to make sense of a word. That's not just true for Gavagai, it's true for every word. Even in English, meanings can shift. If someone says bank, do they mean the side of a river or a place for money? You need context. But even with context, meanings rely on how we interpret signs, not just what's out there. Now think of a situation. You arrive in a village where no one speaks your language. You sit near the fire. A child drops a stick into the flames. An adult says something you don't understand. You take notes. You watch faces, hands, reactions. You start to build a list of words and what they might mean. You begin to form a theory of the language. But Quine says your theory is underdetermined. That means the facts don't decide one single answer. You can make several theories that fit the data. Maybe the word they used meant burn, or maybe it meant hot, or maybe it was a warning, don't do that. Each one could match the scene. And if you go deeper, you run into more problems. Let's say you get better at the language. You can have simple conversations. You can point to things and get the right names. But what happens when you try to translate a sentence like, "It's wrong to take what isn't yours"? That sentence is tied to ideas, not just objects. It's full of values, beliefs, and customs. How do you know if your translation captures all that? Maybe their word for wrong doesn't line up with yours. Maybe they don't think about ownership the same way. Radical translation doesn't just deal with vocabulary. It challenges the idea that there's one true meaning hidden in a word. Instead, meaning depends on use, setting, and background. What sounds like a match might only be a rough fit. You can see this when people try to translate poetry or jokes. A poem in one language might lose its rhythm, rhyme, or feeling when turned into another. A joke that works in one culture falls flat in another. Even when the words are right, something gets lost. That's not a mistake. It shows that meaning goes beyond words. It lives in habits, reactions, timing, tone. In radical translation, there's no way to test which theory is right. Two translators might do the job in two very different ways, and both could work. They might build different dictionaries, write different grammar rules, teach different lessons. But as long as the speakers respond in expected ways, both translations look correct. Quine called this the indeterminacy of translation. This idea isn't just about language. It spreads into how we understand people. We often think we know what someone means when they speak, but our understanding rests on shared habits, not direct access to their thoughts. We match patterns, we fill in blanks, we guess, even if we don't notice it. When someone says, "I'm fine," they might mean they're fine, or they might not want to talk, or they might be upset but polite. We read tone, look at their face, and decide what the words really mean. It's not pure logic, it's social learning, and it's not foolproof. Back in the field, the translator makes progress. She starts to map the grammar, she builds a glossary, she learns to ask questions. But every step still relies on the idea that her guesses fit the way the speakers carve up the world. If that assumption is off, her whole model might be off, and she might never know. Let's say she hears two new words, blarka and trala. One gets said when the sun comes out, the other when someone lights a lamp. She thinks both mean light, but maybe one means natural light and the other man-made light. Or maybe one means day and the other means brightness. Or maybe one is a greeting used in daylight. She can only tell by building more connections and testing how people respond. Quine's point is not that translation is impossible. It's that it's always open-ended. Even in our own language, we adjust meanings over time. New slang comes in. Old words shift, meanings bend based on who's speaking and who's listening. So when you start from zero, as in radical translation, you don't get one final fixed answer. You get working models. Some people find that unsettling. They want language to be exact, like math. But Quine showed that language is more like a set of tools. We use them to get things done, not to mirror the world exactly. And sometimes, different tools can do the same job. You don't need to be a field linguist to run into this. It happens when you try to understand a different culture, read an old text, or talk to someone with a different background. You make guesses, you match patterns, you hope your version lines up with theirs. But the gap never fully closes. Radical translation reminds us that language isn't just words and grammar. It's ways of living, ways of noticing, ways of responding. And when those ways differ, translation becomes not just hard, but radically uncertain.